Beneath the windswept plateaus of central Anatolia lie the broken walls of a city once greater than memory itself. Stones half buried in grass, gates guarded by lions of weathered granite, and sanctuaries carved into the living rock still whisper of a forgotten age. Empires rise, flourish, and fade, yet some vanish so completely that even their names dissolve into silence. For over 2 millennia, the Hittites were such a people, rulers of kings, rivals of Egypt, architects of treaties, and keepers of myths. And then, almost without trace, they were gone. It was only in the last century that fragments of clay, uncovered in the ruins of Hattusa, spoke again in a language older than Greek, older even than Latin, the earliest written tongue of the Indo-European world. From those voices, a buried superpower emerged. Armies of chariots, gods of storms and serpents, queens who wrote to pharaohs, and kings who balanced war with diplomacy. Tonight, we walk slowly through their story, through ruins, tablets, and myth, to piece together the empire that time erased. This is Fall Asleep to the entire history of the Hittites, the forgotten superpower. Chapter 1. The discovery of Hattusa High on the Anatolian plateau, where the land rises in waves of stone and steppe. The winds carry a stillness that feels older than history itself. Here, in central Turkey, scattered walls of grey limestone stretch across the hillsides, broken but persistent, as if the earth itself had grown fortifications. For centuries, these ruins lay silent and half forgotten, their story erased even from memory. Shepherds passed by with their flocks. Villagers tilled the soil nearby, but few paused to wonder who had once ruled this commanding place. The city of Hattusa had become a ghost before it was even remembered. Its name lost, its builders vanished. It was in the 19th century, during the age of exploration and archaeology, that outsiders began to take notice. European travelers, moving across the Ottoman Empire in search of antiquities, stumbled upon colossal stone gateways, rising from the earth like fractured monuments. One bore the stern visage of lions, their eyes eroded yet unmistakably regal. Another showed sphinxes carved with enigmatic grace, their hybrid forms evoking both guardianship and mystery. These were not the modest remains of a village or fortress. They suggested a capital, a center of power, a place where kings had once demanded tribute and armies had marched out across the ancient world. The first reports sent back to Europe were tinged with awe and uncertainty. Some speculated that the ruins might belong to the Phrygians, others to an obscure offshoot of Assyrian culture. Yet the scale of the fortifications resisted easy categorization. Vast stretches of wall snaked across the hills for miles, enclosing an area larger than most Bronze Age cities. Gateways were flanked by towers, and stone foundations hinted at temples, palaces, and ceremonial courtyards. Whoever had lived here had commanded immense resources, both human and natural, and yet the chronicles of antiquity were silent. Greek historians did not speak of them. Roman writers offered no tales. Their very memory had been extinguished. It was not until systematic excavations began in the early 20th century, led by the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler, that the full scope of the site began to unfold. Digging into the soil of Boghazköy, the modern village that sat atop the ruins, his team uncovered thousands of clay tablets, inscribed with delicate cuneiform signs. These were not random fragments, they were archives, whole libraries of administration, myth, and diplomacy. Suddenly, the mute stones of Hattusa acquired a voice. For the first time in over 3,000 years, the lost empire of the Hittites began to speak. The discovery was nothing short of transformative. Among the tablets were treaties carved into clay, including one with Pharaoh Rameses II of Egypt, describing peace after the great Battle of Kadesh. This alone was a revelation, for it meant the Hittites were not some minor culture overshadowed by Egypt and Mesopotamia. They had stood as equals, as rivals to the might of the Nile. Other tablets revealed laws, religious rituals, and even myths. Stories of gods locked in combat with serpents, and kings appealing to the heavens for justice. In one stroke, a forgotten superpower had re-emerged from obscurity. As archaeologists traced the layout of Hattusa, the scale of the city came into sharper focus. Its walls stretched nearly 6 kilometers, enclosing both a lower city and an elevated acropolis. Within lay vast temple complexes, the most important dedicated to the storm god Teshub, whose cult dominated Hittite religion. Stone stairways climbed the hillsides, leading to open courtyards where festivals and sacrifices once bound king and cosmos together. Beyond the sacred spaces were the palaces of kings, with chambers designed for both administration and ritual. The city was not just a political center, but a cosmological one, arranged to reflect divine order on Earth. The architecture itself bore subtle signs of syncretism. Sphinxes at the gates recalled Egypt, yet their features were distinctly Anatolian. Reliefs carved into living rock bore the influence of Mesopotamia, while retaining a style uniquely Hittite. Hattusa had stood at the crossroads of civilizations, absorbing and transforming ideas from neighbors while projecting its own power outward. This cultural blending hinted at a civilization deeply connected to the wider Bronze Age world, and yet with a character all its own. And still, the silence of history lingers. Why had this city, so vast and sophisticated, been erased so thoroughly? Unlike Egypt, where hieroglyphs preserved memory, or Mesopotamia, where scribes maintained traditions across millennia, the Hittites left no successors to carry on their language once the empire collapsed. Their archives, written on fragile clay, were buried by fire and rubble. Their descendants, if they remained, merged into the shifting populations of Anatolia and Syria. When the last embers of Hattusa's temples died, so too did the memory of a people who had once commanded half the Near East. Walking today among the ruins, the scale still humbles. The Lion Gate, though weathered, stands as it did in the 14th century BCE, its guardians gazing outward across the plateau. The Sphinx Gate, partially reconstructed, reveals a glimpse of the grandeur that once welcomed travelers and dignitaries. The foundations of temples stretch in orderly rows, each stone block echoing the rhythm of ritual. Even the city's walls, rebuilt and maintained by successive kings, follow the contours of the hills with a precision that feels almost alive. To stand in Hattusa is to feel the weight of a vanished power pressing silently against the present. The rediscovery of the city not only resurrected the Hittites as a subject of study, but also reshaped our understanding of the late Bronze Age. For centuries, the narrative of the ancient world was dominated by Egypt, Mesopotamia, and later, Greece. Hattusa forced scholars to widen the map. Here was a third superpower, one capable of battling pharaohs, forging peace treaties, and maintaining an empire stretching from the Aegean to the edges of Mesopotamia. And yet, the fact that such a power could disappear so utterly raised unsettling questions about the fragility of civilization itself. Each season of excavation reveals more. Seal impressions of royal officials, ritual pits filled with offerings, archives that detail daily life in astonishing precision. And yet, for all the progress, the gaps remain vast. Who were the common people of Hattusa, beyond the kings and priests preserved in tablets? What songs did they sing? What fears did they whisper as empires rose and fell around them? The ruins offer fragments, but no complete answers. The story of Hattusa's discovery is, in a way, a reminder of how easily human achievement can be buried, both literally and in memory. For nearly 3,000 years, the city slept beneath the hills, its stones crumbling but enduring. It took the curiosity of foreign travelers, the persistence of archaeologists, and the chance survival of clay archives to awaken it once more. And even now, as the stones stand open to the sun and wind, much of its life remains in shadow. One cannot help but wonder, how many other cities lie hidden beneath fields and forests, waiting for their voices to return? How many empires have vanished so completely that no trace will ever emerge? Hattusa was fortunate, or perhaps fated, to be rediscovered, but the silence that once covered it may still blanket countless others. The winds across the Anatolian plateau carry that silence still. They move through broken gates, along toppled walls, and across sanctuaries once filled with song. In their whisper lies both the weight of history and the vastness of what has been lost. The rediscovery of Hattusa is not the end of a mystery, but the beginning of one, a threshold into a forgotten world, where answers remain scattered like shards of clay waiting to be pieced together. And so, the story unfolds, step by step, deeper into the ruins of memory. Chapter 2: The Clay Tablets of Boghazköy. In the year 1906, the quiet Anatolian village of Boghazköy became the setting for one of archaeology's most extraordinary revelations. Beneath its modest fields and houses, German archaeologist Hugo Winkler began to unearth thousands of clay tablets, their surfaces etched with ancient wedge-shaped impressions. What at first seemed like fragments soon multiplied into an overwhelming archive. entire libraries preserved in baked earth. These tablets, pulled patiently from the soil, were not isolated relics, but the very heartbeat of a lost empire. The clay carried words in multiple tongues. There was Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the Near East, used to communicate with Egypt, Babylonia, and Assyria. There was Hurrian, reflecting cultural ties to neighboring peoples. And, most astonishing of all, there was a language no scholar had ever seen before, the speech of the Hittites themselves. Line by line, the forgotten voice of an empire began to emerge, written down in a script inherited from Mesopotamian scribes, but speaking with an Anatolian cadence. The Hittites had written their history, their laws, their myths, and their treaties into clay, a medium fragile to hold, yet resilient enough to endure 3 millennia in the soil. Among these discoveries was a treasure beyond measure, a treaty between Pharaoh Rameses II of Egypt and the Hittite king Hattusa III, crafted in the aftermath of the Great Battle of Kadesh around 1259 BCE, inscribed on a silver tablet in antiquity. Its text was carefully copied into the Hittite archives. Here, for the first time in world history, we see a binding international peace agreement preserved in writing. 2 superpowers, once enemies, now swore mutual defense and recognition. Today, a replica of this treaty hangs in the United Nations headquarters in New York, a symbol of diplomacy that still resonates across centuries. Yet, at the time of its discovery, it transformed scholarly understanding. The Hittites were not peripheral. They had stood shoulder to shoulder with Egypt in shaping the destiny of the Late Bronze Age. The tablets revealed much more than treaties. They held the rhythms of everyday governance, tax records, edicts, and correspondence. Kings issued decrees on land ownership and disputes. Officials wrote reports of harvests, offerings, and border conflicts. Ritual texts described the elaborate ceremonies binding king, gods, and people in a web of divine order. Mythological cycles spoke of gods in struggle and renewal, storm deities facing sea dragons, and festivals that mark the turning of seasons. In these myths, scholars recognized echoes of wider Indo-European traditions, linking Hittite narratives with those that would later surface in Greece and beyond. What had seemed a silent ruin now spoke with a polyphonic voice. The discovery posed as many questions as it answered. Why had the Hittites preserved so many records and in such detail? Was it a matter of administrative necessity? A bureaucracy stretched across vast lands from Anatolia to Syria? Or did it reflect something deeper? An anxiety about memory? A need to fix history in clay so that it would not be forgotten? Unlike Egypt's grand stone inscriptions designed for eternity, the Hittites relied on fragile tablets stored in palace archives. It was an irony of history that these brittle objects, easily broken, proved more enduring than walls or temples. Winkler himself could not have imagined the scale of what he had uncovered. By the time his excavations ended, more than 30,000 tablets and fragments had been catalogued, making Hattusa one of the richest archaeological archives ever found. Each new season of excavation added to the chorus of voices, letters between kings, prayers of queens, instructions for festivals, even fragments of international law. Taken together, they created a portrait of an empire both powerful and precarious, meticulously recording its struggles against chaos. The process of decipherment was painstaking. Scholars labored to understand the unfamiliar language encoded in cuneiform signs. Slowly, it became clear that this was the earliest written form of an Indo-European tongue, the linguistic ancestor of Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and many modern languages. The Hittites had not only built an empire, they had left behind the oldest known branch of a linguistic family that would stretch across continents. Their archives did not just reveal history, they altered the very framework of how we understand the spread of human speech. Even so, gaps remain. For every complete tablet, there are dozens of fragments, broken pieces of narratives or laws without beginnings or endings. Sometimes only a few lines survive. A treaty half erased, a prayer interrupted, a myth cut short. The silence between these fragments can feel heavier than the words themselves, reminding us that most of the archive is still missing. How many more tablets lie buried beneath the earth still untouched? How many stories are forever lost to fire and time? There is also the mystery of why the Hittites chose to preserve so much in writing. The scale of their archives suggests a culture deeply invested in record keeping. Was this a tool of control, ensuring the king's will could be carried across provinces? Was it an attempt to stabilize succession in a dynasty often racked by intrigue and revolt? Or did the Hittites sense, perhaps more keenly than others, the fragility of empire and seek to bind their memory in clay against the erosion of time? Walking among the ruins of Hattusa today, it is difficult to imagine the palaces filled with shelves of clay. Yet archaeologists know that these tablets once lay in wooden racks, neatly arranged by subject, carefully catalogued by scribes. When the city fell, fire consumed the buildings, but the flames baked the clay harder, preserving what might otherwise have crumbled. Thus destruction became preservation, erasure became survival. The voices of the Hittites endured only because catastrophe struck their city. In their words, the empire breathes again, kings boasting of victories, queens petitioning gods for healing, priests recording the details of sacrifice, and scribes translating letters from foreign courts. Through them, we see the Hittites not as shadows on the margins of Egypt and Mesopotamia, but as a people of equal complexity, ambition, and doubt. They emerge as conquerors and diplomats, believers and poets, and yet for all their meticulous records, their fate remains shrouded in silence. The Boghazköy tablets stand as one of archaeology's greatest treasures, a chorus of clay that bridges 3,000 years of absence. They give us glimpses of treaties and myths, of daily administration and divine worship. And still, they leave us wondering, how much more remains hidden beneath Anatolia's soil, waiting to be uncovered? What secrets still lie sleeping in the earth, sealed in fragile clay, waiting for their voices to be heard? In the quiet galleries of museums where these tablets now rest behind glass, their presence is almost paradoxical. They are at once mundane and sacred, simple lumps of earth, yet inscribed with the memory of a forgotten superpower. To read them is to feel time collapse, to sense the breath of a civilization that once stood against Egypt and Babylon, now speaking again after millennia of silence. And as we leave the archives of Boghazköy behind, we step deeper into the Hittite world where myth, ritual, and stone will continue to reveal fragments of a story both vast and unfinished. Chapter 3. The Lion Gate of Hattusa, on the windswept Anatolian plateau, where rolling hills rise into ridges of bare stone, the ruins of Hattusa still command the landscape. Approaching the ancient city, one is struck first not by its temples or palaces, but by the sheer scale of its fortifications. Kilometers of walls once encircled the capital, built from massive limestone blocks that seem to grow out of the earth itself. They climb the slopes and descend into valleys, binding the settlement within an embrace of stone. To cross into this world, ancient travelers did not simply pass through an opening in the wall. They entered through monumental gateways, each carved and aligned with symbolic intent. Among these portals, one stands apart, the Lion Gate. Here, around the 14th century BCE, Hittite masons carved twin guardians directly from massive blocks of living rock. Each lion stands frozen in eternal watch, jaws slightly parted, eyes staring outward with a gaze both protective and forbidding. Though the centuries have softened their features, the impression remains unmistakable. These were not ornaments. They were sentinels. Their presence announced to emissaries, traders, and soldiers alike that they were crossing into a realm under divine protection. In Hittite thought, the lion was no ordinary beast. Across the ancient Near East, lions carried associations of power, royalty, and the favor of the gods. To hunt a lion was to demonstrate kingly strength. To be guarded by lions was to proclaim a realm beyond the reach of chaos. In myths preserved on the Boghazköy tablets, storm gods battle monstrous foes, and lions appear as emblems of ferocity and triumph. Thus, the Lion Gate was more than military architecture. It was a threshold sanctified by cosmic order, where stone and myth fused into a single message of authority. The gate itself was functional, of course. Its narrow passage forced incoming traffic into controlled lines, where soldiers could observe and, if needed, defend. Yet the artistry of the lines suggests that its builders intended far more than practicality. They meant to impress awe upon the visitor, to establish a psychological frontier before the city itself was revealed. One can imagine a caravan of merchants arriving from Syria, or an envoy from Egypt, pausing before the carved guardians. Did they read in those eyes a silent warning? Did they sense the presence of a power that claimed not only the land, but also the sanction of the gods? Archaeologists who first uncovered the gate in the early 20th century marveled at the scale of its construction. The blocks weigh many tons, carefully fitted together without mortar, forming an archway that has withstood more than 3,000 years of wind and rain. The lions themselves, carved in high relief, are nearly life-sized. Their musculature suggests both realism and idealization. Not natural lions, but archetypal lions, guardians shaped in the realm between earth and divinity. Yet mysteries remain. Were these lions meant to represent specific deities, perhaps manifestations of the storm god's protective power? Or did they belong to a wider tradition of lion symbolism shared across Anatolia and Mesopotamia? At Illuyanka, not far from Hattusa, similar lion carvings flank another ancient gate, suggesting a regional pattern of sacred guardianship. But in Hattusa, the lion's placement at one of the city's main entrances gives them unique significance, as though the entire capital were framed within their gaze. The Lion Gate also invites reflection on the Hittite view of thresholds. In many ancient traditions, gates and doorways were not mere passages, but liminal zones, spaces of transition where the human world met the divine. To cross a threshold was to enact a ritual, to leave behind the profane and step into the sacred. Perhaps the Lion Gate embodied precisely this idea. Those who passed beneath the lions were symbolically entering a world aligned with the cosmic order, where the king ruled not merely as a man, but as the appointed servant of the gods. When we stand before the gate today, much is silent. The lions' faces are eroded, their once sharp lines weathered by centuries of frost and sun. The walls they guarded are broken. The soldiers and scribes who once hurried beneath them long vanished. Yet the presence of the lions remains. Visitors describe a sense of being watched, of stepping into an unseen drama that lingers in the stones. It is as if the guardians still fulfill their task, bridging past and present, compelling us to acknowledge the power they once embodied. The Lion Gate also raises deeper questions about memory. Why did later ages forget the Hittites so completely, when their architecture and symbols were carved on such a monumental scale? Did the gate's lions fail to preserve the empire's presence in human consciousness? Or were they always meant to speak, not to eternity, but to those who passed through in their own time? The silence of the site leaves such questions unanswered, yet the mystery itself becomes part of the gate's aura. In this way, the Lion Gate of Hattusa stands not only as an archaeological landmark, but also as a meditation in stone. It reminds us that power is never merely practical. It is staged, imagined, sanctified. For the Hittites, to rule required more than armies and treaties. It required symbols that spoke directly to the human soul, binding the authority of kings to the order of the cosmos. The lions, gazing outward from their ancient blocks, were part of that language, and so, as we move deeper into Hattusa, beyond the gate and into the heart of the city, we carry with us the impression left by those guardians. Their message, though eroded, still lingers. To pass into this place is to cross a threshold, not just of stone, but of meaning. Chapter 4. The Sphinx Gate and the Hidden Tunnels. The southern slope of the ancient city, where the walls of Hattusa rise against the Anatolian sky, another gate still stands in quiet defiance of time. Less celebrated than the Lion Gate, yet equally charged with mystery, it is known as the Sphinx Gate. To approach it today is to stand at the threshold of both artistry and enigma, for its guardians are not lions of the earth, but beings drawn from the borderlands of imagination. Sphinxes. The Sphinx, in many cultures, embodies the idea of liminality. It is a creature part human, part beast, dwelling at thresholds where ordinary reality bends into something more symbolic. In Hattusa, the carved sphinxes flanking this gate once greeted those entering from the south. Their bodies are leonine, their wings arched upward, their faces marked with distinctly Anatolian traits, a divergence from the Egyptian sphinxes of Giza, yet perhaps inspired by them. Here is evidence of cultural dialogue across the late Bronze Age world, where the courts of pharaohs, kings, and great lords exchanged not only goods, but also symbols. These sphinxes, though weathered, still bear the weight of that exchange. The placement of the sphinxes was no accident. As with the lions, these beings were guardians, yet of a more ambiguous kind. Their hybrid forms suggested power that transcended categories, beings who stood between worlds, animal and human, mortal and divine, protector and challenger. To pass between them was not merely to enter a fortified city, it was to submit oneself to the scrutiny of beings who embodied riddles and mysteries. Beneath the Sphinx Gate lies something even more intriguing. A narrow tunnel, carved with precision into the foundation of the walls. Unlike many features of Hattusa, this tunnel remains remarkably intact. Visitors today can walk its length, descending into shadow and re-emerging into light. Its walls are close, the air cool, the ceiling low enough to press a sense of confinement upon the traveler. Archaeologists have long debated its function. Was it designed as a secret military passage, an escape route for defenders in case of siege? Or was it ritual, a ceremonial path, allowing initiates to journey symbolically into the underworld and back, reenacting cycles of death and rebirth? The idea of tunnels as ritual pathways is not foreign to the ancient Near East. Across Anatolia and Mesopotamia, myths speak of gods who descend into shadowed realms, only to emerge renewed. For the Hittites, whose pantheon absorbed and reshaped neighboring traditions, the symbolism of descent may have been central to their religious imagination. Passing beneath the Sphinx Gate through its hidden corridor may have been an enactment of such myth, a liminal act of leaving one state of being and entering another. The military explanation, however, cannot be dismissed. The city of Hattusa was heavily fortified, its architects deeply practical in matters of defense. A tunnel beneath a gate could allow defenders to sally forth unexpectedly, or retreat unseen into the safety of the inner city. The duality of interpretations is telling. For the Hittites, there may have been no sharp divide between sacred and practical. The same structure could serve both as a functional escape and as a symbolic journey, a union of earthly defense and cosmic meaning. The sphinxes themselves deepen this ambiguity. Unlike the Egyptian sphinx, which is often silent and passive, the Anatolian sphinxes carry a more watchful presence. Their eyes, though worn, once glared upon those who passed between them. Were they guardians of the tunnel below as well as the gate above? Did their placement suggest that the journey through stone and shadow was under their surveillance, a rite overseen by beings who belonged neither wholly to heaven nor to earth? Archaeological records show that the Sphinx Gate was part of Hattusa's later fortifications, dating to the height of the empire in the 13th century BCE. By then, the Hittites had stretched their influence across Anatolia and into the Levant, standing as rivals to Egypt itself. The choice of sphinxes as guardians may reflect this cosmopolitan moment, a time when foreign motifs were not merely borrowed, but reshaped into distinctly Hittite expressions. What remains striking is how these images were embedded into architecture, not as decoration, but as integral symbols of passage and power. To walk through the Sphinx Gate today is to sense layers of meaning pressing upon the stones. Above, hybrid guardians carved in enduring relief. Below, a tunnel carved through darkness. Both invite reflection on thresholds on the spaces between. The Hittites seem to understand that power was not only maintained by armies and treaties, but also by shaping the imagination of those who entered their capital. Every visitor, whether emissary or pilgrim, would have confronted not only walls of stone, but a carefully orchestrated encounter with myth. And yet, much is lost. The sphinxes that once adorned the gate were removed in the early 20th century, taken to museums far from their homeland. Only replicas now guard the site, while the originals sit in glass cases in Istanbul and Berlin. To see them displaced is to feel the rupture of context. The guardians no longer keep their ancient watch, but their mystery endures, not diminished, only transposed. The tunnel, however, remains in its place, and those who walk its length still emerge with a quiet sense of awe. Its silence, its cool air, its careful construction, all speak of intentions that cannot be fully known. We can measure its dimensions, date its stones, and trace its path, but its purpose resists final explanation. Perhaps this resistance is part of its design, for a gate adorned with sphinxes, creatures of riddles. What could be more fitting than a hidden passage that refuses to yield its full secret? Thus, the Sphinx Gate of Hattusa is more than a relic of architecture. It is a text in stone, a story without an ending. It whispers of exchanges between civilizations, of thresholds that blur the line between sacred and practical, of tunnels that lead both into earth and into imagination. As with the Sphinx itself, the answers remain elusive, leaving us only with the riddle. Why here? Why this form? Why this descent into shadow? The silence of the gate offers no reply, only the invitation to wonder, and perhaps that is its truest legacy. A threshold that continues to beckon us across the millennia, asking us to step forward into mystery. Chapter 5. The Hittite Pantheon at Yazılıkaya. A short walk from the walls of Hattusa, where the plateau slopes upward into limestone outcrops, lies one of the most haunting sanctuaries of the ancient world. Known today as Yazılıkaya, or inscribed rock, it is here that the Hittites carved their most vivid expressions of faith. Unlike temples built from timber and stone that could burn or crumble, Yazılıkaya was fashioned from the living rock itself, intended to endure beyond the lifetimes of kings. The sanctuary opens as a natural cleft in the limestone, a hidden court beneath the sky, where high walls of stone enclose the visitor in silence. Into these walls, the Hittites carved their gods. Two chambers form the heart of the sanctuary. Chamber A, the larger of the two, contains the most famous reliefs. A long procession of deities, carefully arranged in pairs, striding toward one another across the rock face. On the left march the gods, on the right the goddesses. At the point of meeting, carved with greater prominence, stand the storm god Teshub and the mother goddess Hippat, central figures in the Hittite pantheon. Teshub is shown standing on two mountain gods, a vivid sign of his command over the natural world. Hippat, his consort, stands upon a lion, the beast that symbolized ferocity and sovereignty. Together they embody the divine balance of storm and fertility, sky and earth. Behind them follow other deities, gods of weather, of mountains, of the sun, of the moon. Many bear symbols of their roles, sickles, spears, or curved horns. The reliefs are not casual images, but an ordered tableau, a kind of visual liturgy. Each god has his or her place, echoing the structure of a cosmic hierarchy. The impression is overwhelming. A divine assembly, frozen in stone, where the boundaries of myth and ritual blur. Chamber B, smaller and more shadowed, presents a different atmosphere. Here stands the colossal figure of the underworld god, carved in deeper relief, wearing a tall conical hat and armed with a sword. He looms above smaller figures, his presence unmistakable. Some scholars believe this chamber may have been dedicated to rites of death and renewal, a subterranean counterpoint to the skylit procession of Chamber A. Together, the two spaces represent not merely a pantheon, but the fullness of a cosmos, heaven and earth, day and night, life and death. The sanctuary has stirred scholarly debate for over a century. Some propose that the reliefs formed part of the Hittite New Year rituals, where the renewal of the king's mandate was enacted before the gods. The procession of deities may have served as witnesses, affirming cosmic order as the seasons turned. Others suggest that Yazılıkaya functioned as a kind of calendar in stone. The ordered sequence of gods may correspond to days, months, or festivals, encoding the rhythm of time into the living rock. A more speculative view sees the reliefs as a cosmic map, charting not earthly geography but the structure of the heavens, a starry counterpart to the pantheon's order. What is certain is that Yazılıkaya reflects a theology of remarkable sophistication. The Hittites absorbed influences from Mesopotamia, Syria, and Anatolia, weaving them into a syncretic faith. Their gods were not distant abstractions, but tangible beings tied to mountains, storms, rivers, and the underworld. At Yazılıkaya, these forces are brought together in one vast assembly. The sanctuary suggests a worldview where every element of nature was personified, ordered, and bound into the service of divine kingship. The site also raises questions of access. Was Yazılıkaya open to the public, or reserved for priests and royalty? The scale of the carvings suggests they were meant to impress, but the sanctuary's enclosed setting gives it an intimate, almost hidden quality. Perhaps ordinary worshippers glimpse the outer processions, while the inner chambers remained the preserve of the king, whose role as mediator between gods and humans was central to Hittite ideology. To stand among these carvings may have been to stand in the very axis of the cosmos, where human ritual touched divine order. Modern archaeologists, from Charles Texier in the 1830s to Kurt Bittel in the 20th century, have documented the sanctuary in detail. Yet the meaning of Yazılıkaya resists full decipherment. The weathered faces of the gods still gaze across the centuries, but the hymns and prayers that once gave them voice have largely vanished. Without the liturgies that accompanied them, the reliefs remain a silent script, open to interpretation. There is also the lingering question of intent. Why here, just outside the city walls? Was Yazılıkaya a counterbalance to the urban temples of Hattusa, a reminder that true sanctity lay not within man-made enclosures, but in the eternal stone of the earth? By choosing to carve their gods into rock, the Hittites declared a faith that could not be erased by fire or conquest. And yet, in time, even these carvings fell into silence, their meaning fading until rediscovered by modern eyes. Visitors today often describe Yazılıkaya as eerily timeless. The sanctuary seems both open and enclosed, both earthly and otherworldly. Sunlight strikes the processions in morning or evening, throwing long shadows across the reliefs, animating the gods as though they still march. To step into Chamber B is to feel the weight of stone pressing close, the underworld god looming above, silent but not absent. The experience lingers, unsettling yet awe-inspiring. In the end, Yazılıkaya remains what it was always meant to be, a threshold, a place where stone becomes scripture, where the divine procession meets the mortal gaze, where questions linger without resolution. Was it a calendar, a map, a ritual stage, or all of these at once? The sanctuary gives no final answer. It leaves us with the impression of a people whose gods were carved not in fragile memory, but in the eternal face of the earth itself. And yet, even so, their meaning still drifts beyond our grasp. The rock sanctuary endures, unchanging, while human interpretation shifts and falters. The gods stand in procession, waiting, as if the ritual will resume once again when the right voices return. Chapter 6. The Storm. God's Cult in. The windswept highlands of Anatolia, where the sky dominates the horizon and the seasons shift with sudden force, the Hittites place their trust in the storm. Thunderheads rolling over the plateau, lightning splitting the darkness, torrents of rain or sudden drought. These were not merely natural events. For the Hittites, they were the visible signs of a divine will. At the center of their cosmology stood Teshub, the storm god, master of weather and warfare, a deity both feared and venerated as the axis around which order and survival revolved. The cult of Teshub was not an abstraction. It was woven into every field sown with grain, every chariot sent into battle, every prayer uttered in the shadow of the city walls. Anatolia was a land where agriculture depended on timely rains, where storms could bring either abundance or ruin. For this reason, the storm god was more than a celestial figure. He was the pulse of life itself. To neglect him was to risk famine, rebellion, and the collapse of cosmic order. At Hattusa, the capital, his cult occupied the highest prominence. Great temples were dedicated to him and his consort, the mother goddess Hepat. Ritual texts uncovered in the archives of Boghazköy describe elaborate festivals held in his honor. Priests poured libations of wine and beer. Offerings were made of bread and livestock, and the people gathered to sing hymns that praised his power. In these ceremonies, the storm god was invoked not only as the bringer of rain, but also as the protector of the kingdom, the force who struck down enemies and preserved the realm. The role of the king was inseparable from this worship. Hittite rulers styled themselves as the chosen of the storm god, his earthly representatives. When the king rode into battle at the head of his chariot forces, he was not merely a general, but the embodiment of divine will. To disobey him was to disobey Teshub himself. This fusion of kingship and divinity created a powerful image of authority, one rooted not in human ambition, but in the alignment of the earthly throne with the celestial. And yet, the myths of Teshub reveal a figure more complex than unchallenged supremacy. In one cycle, preserved on clay tablets, he wages war against the sea serpent Illuyanka. Twice he is defeated, and only through cunning and the aid of others does he prevail. In another tale, he quarrels with rival gods, sometimes yielding, sometimes asserting dominance. These stories present a god who is not invulnerable, but who struggles, falters, and recovers. Why would the supreme god of an empire be portrayed as vulnerable? Some scholars suggest that these myths mirror the Hittite understanding of power itself, that kingship, like the storm, was never absolute, but always contested, always fragile. Just as storms could nourish or destroy, so too could rulers succeed or fail. By acknowledging the vulnerability of their god, the Hittites may have embraced a worldview in which chaos was not banished, but managed, woven into the very fabric of order. Festivals dedicated to Teshub reflected this tension. The Puruli festival, celebrated in the spring, reenacted his battle against Illuyanka. Ritual actors and priests retold the myth, ensuring that the god's triumph over chaos was renewed each year. It was not enough that Teshub had once prevailed. The victory had to be continually remembered, continually enacted. This ritual repetition, anchored the community in a cycle of renewal, binding the rhythms of myth to the cycles of the seasons. Within the sanctuary of Yazılıkaya, the storm god's image looms among the processions of deities. He stands upon mountain gods, a clear sign of his authority over nature, while his consort Hepat balances him as queen. The reliefs there show not an isolated deity, but a figure embedded in a pantheon, one who ruled, but also one who contended with equals, rivals, and kin. In this balance of power, cosmic order was less a fixed hierarchy than a negotiation, a fragile peace that had to be maintained. The offerings made to Teshub reveal further layers of his cult. Clay tablets detail sacrifices of oxen and sheep, alongside libations of beer, honey, and oil. Processions would have wound their way through Hattusa, bearing these gifts to his temple, where fire and incense carried prayers upward. For the Hittites, sacrifice was not mere homage, it was an act of reciprocity. The god gave rain and victory, the people gave sustenance in return. To neglect the exchange was to risk imbalance, to invite drought, defeat, or rebellion. Even the geography of the Hittite world bore the imprint of the storm god's presence. Mountains were seen as his throne, high places as his favored dwelling. When thunder rolled across the ridges, it was Teshub's voice. When rain fell upon the fields, it was his blessing. When lightning struck, it was his spear hurled from the heavens. The natural world was inseparable from divine action. Each storm a reminder that the fate of the empire lay not in human hands alone. And yet, in the clay tablets, we glimpse something more intimate. Prayers survive in which kings and queens plead with the storm god, not in tones of triumph, but of desperation. They ask for healing, for rain, for mercy in the face of plague. These voices remind us that the storm god was not simply a symbol of imperial power, but a presence woven into the fragile lives of rulers and subjects alike. His favor could not be presumed. It had to be sought, earned, and renewed. In the end, the cult of Teshub reflects the paradox of the Hittite worldview, the need to control what could never be fully controlled. The storm god embodied the tension between order and chaos, sovereignty and struggle. His worship bound together king and cosmos, earth and sky, ritual and survival. But in his myths of defeat and renewal, he also revealed that even divine power was never absolute. It was always contested, always in motion, like the storms that swept across the Anatolian plateau. Standing today among the ruins of Hattusa, beneath a wide and restless sky, one can still imagine the sound of drums and chants rising in the spring festival, calling the storm god to renew his victory. The winds stir through the broken stones, the clouds gather over the ridges, and the question lingers. Did the Hittites ever truly believe that chaos could be mastered? Or did they know deep down that their greatest god was as vulnerable as the empire itself? Chapter 7. The Myth of Illuyanka in the quiet recesses of Hittite archives, pressed into fragile clay, lies one of the most haunting stories of the ancient world. The myth of Illuyanka, the serpent, preserved in cuneiform script. The tale was likely recited aloud during seasonal festivals, echoing across the courtyards of temples and the chambers of kings. It is a story of battle, defeat, cunning, and ultimate sacrifice. But more than a tale of gods and monsters, it is a window into the Hittite understanding of the cosmos, a world where order is fragile, where even the storm god himself can falter, and where renewal comes only through struggle. The narrative begins with conflict. The storm god Teshub confronts Illuyanka, a monstrous serpent whose coils embody chaos. In their first encounter, the serpent triumphs. The god of storms, lord of sky, rain, and thunder, is defeated. This moment of vulnerability is striking. Unlike many mythic traditions where the sky god conquers effortlessly, here the cosmic order itself falters. The forces of chaos prevail, and the god retreats. The story lingers on this defeat, acknowledging a truth the Hittites knew well, that storms fail, rains falter, and power can be overturned in a single season. Yet the myth does not end with loss. In a second telling, the storm god turns to cunning rather than brute force. He allies with a mortal, seeking aid to outwit his enemy. Through deception, Illuyanka is drawn into a trap. Bound, disarmed, and weakened, the serpent is finally struck down. Order is restored, but not without cost. In some versions, Teshub must sacrifice his own son, who had married into the serpent's family, ensuring that victory is inseparable from grief. Here, triumph is bittersweet. It is not conquest without consequence, but survival bought at the price of what is most beloved. Scholars have long debated the deeper meaning of this myth. Some see in Illuyanka the cycle of the seasons, the serpent as drought or winter, the storm god as the rains of spring. Each year, the god is defeated, only to return through ritual renewal, ensuring fertility and abundance for the land. The story was central to the Puruli festival, a spring celebration in which priests and kings reenacted the battle, ensuring that the cosmic order would be renewed for another year. The recitation of the myth was not entertainment. It was ritual performance, binding myth to reality, ensuring that what had been told in the beginning would continue to be true in the present. Others trace the tale to older and wider traditions. Across Mesopotamia, the motif of a sky god battling a serpent recurs. Marduk against Tiamat, Ninurta against the Anzu bird. In the Indo-European world too, echoes resound. Indra against Vritra, Zeus against Typhon, Thor against Jörmungandr. The Hittite version, however, stands apart. Unlike Zeus hurling thunderbolts in unquestioned triumph, Teshub requires trickery, alliances, and sacrifice. The Hittites, it seems, envision power not as absolute, but as precarious, always under threat, always requiring renewal through ritual, community, and cunning. The imagery of the serpent itself carries layers of meaning. In Hittite art and religion, serpents were often associated with the underworld, with cycles of death and rebirth. To slay Illuyanka was not merely to kill a monster, but to enact the eternal struggle between order and chaos, life and death, fertility and barrenness. The serpent's defeat was necessary for the rains to return, for crops to grow, for the empire to survive. Yet the memory of his earlier victory lingered, a reminder that chaos could never be fully destroyed, only held at bay for a time. The cost of victory too is telling, that the storm god must sacrifice his son resonates with archetypes found across cultures. The motif of the dying and sacrificed child, the loss that ensures renewal. In this, the myth speaks to the Hittite recognition of life's fragile balance. Nothing was gained without loss. Every harvest was born of toil, every triumph shadowed by sacrifice. In Illuyanka's coils lay not only destruction, but the price of continuity. Archaeological fragments give us only glimpses of how this myth was lived in ritual. The Puruli festival is believed to have involved processions, chants, and symbolic reenactments, perhaps even actors embodying God and serpent in the temple courtyards of Hattusa. By retelling the myth each spring, the Hittites renewed their covenant with the storm god, ensuring that he would once again defeat Illuyanka and restore order to the cosmos. Without this ritual, the rains might not fall, the serpent might not be bound, and chaos might spill once more into the world. One can imagine the scene. The king, clothed in ceremonial garb, presiding as priests, chant the ancient words, as offerings of bread, beer, and sacrificed animals are laid before the altar. Thunder echoes in the distance, or perhaps only in memory, as the congregation listens to the story that has been told for centuries. The myth was not just about gods, it was about the people, their survival, their hope that the balance of the universe would be renewed for another year. And so the myth of Illuyanka is more than a tale of divine battle. It is a reflection of the Hittite worldview, that order is fragile, that victory is costly, and that survival requires cunning, ritual, and sacrifice. It connects the Hittites to their Mesopotamian neighbors and to distant Indo-European traditions. Yet it retains a distinctly Anatolian voice, one in which even the storm god can fail, one in which power is never absolute, and one in which triumph carries the weight of loss. Today, as we read the clay tablets that carry this myth across 3,000 years, we encounter not merely an ancient story, but an archetype that still resonates. The struggle between order and chaos, the serpent and the storm, the cost of victory. These remain timeless. In the winds that still sweep across the ruins of Hattusa, in the thunder that rolls over the Anatolian plateau, the echoes of Illuyanka's struggle linger, reminding us that the balance of the world has always been fragile, always contested, always renewed in cycles of defeat and triumph. The serpent is slain, but only for a season. Chapter 8. Alaka-Hoyuk and the royal tombs long, before the Hittite kings carved their names into stone. Before their chariots rolled across the Anatolian plateau, the land already bore witness to princely splendor. At the site of Alakahoyuk, some 150 kilometers northeast of modern Ankara, archaeologists uncovered evidence of a flourishing culture that thrived in the 3rd millennium BCE, centuries before the Hittite Empire rose to prominence. Hidden beneath the soil were royal tombs, carefully constructed burial chambers that preserved a world of wealth, ritual, and mystery. When excavations began in the early 20th century, led first by Turkish and German teams, the discoveries astonished scholars. Beneath layers of earth and stone, they found the resting places of elites, men and women laid to rest with gold jewelry, bronze weapons, ceremonial standards, and ornate sun discs. These objects were not merely personal possessions. They were symbols of cosmic order and divine authority, echoing ideas that would later define Hittite kingship. Even before the Hittites, Anatolia's rulers envisioned themselves not simply as leaders of men, but as intermediaries between earth and heaven. Among the most striking finds were the sun discs, large, intricately fashioned emblems of bronze or gold, decorated with radiating spokes, bulls, or stylized birds. Some scholars interpret these as solar symbols, perhaps representing the power of the sun as life-giver, or as emblems of dynastic authority linking the ruler to the divine. Others suggest they may have served in ceremonial processions, mounted on standards carried before kings or priests. Their very form anticipates the imagery of later Hittite religion, where the sun and storm governed the rhythm of life. The tombs themselves reveal elaborate burial practices. Bodies were interred in wooden chambers, often accompanied by animal sacrifices, cattle, deer, and sheep buried alongside their masters. This ritual slaughter hints at beliefs in an afterlife where the dead required attendance, offerings, and power over living creatures. It also suggests a worldview in which death was not an end, but a transition into another realm where status and authority endured. For the people of Alakahoyuk, kingship extended beyond the grave, binding ruler and cosmos in perpetuity. One question lingers over these discoveries. Who were the people of Alakahoyuk? Were they the direct ancestors of the Hittites, part of a continuous Anatolian tradition that culminated in the empire of Hattusa? Or were they a distinct people, later absorbed into the cultural and political orbit of the Hittites? The material record offers tantalizing but inconclusive clues. The iconography of the standards and sun discs seems to resonate with later Hittite symbols, suggesting cultural continuity. Yet the language of these early elites remains unknown, their identities concealed by the silence of time. The ritual sacrifice associated with the royal tombs has drawn particular attention. Excavators noted rows of cattle skulls and horns, carefully arranged, perhaps as offerings to the gods, or as a symbol of wealth and power. In Hittite religion, the bull was closely tied to the storm god Teshub, his strength embodied in the animal's massive form. Was this association already present in the world of Alakahoyuk, centuries before the first Hittite king took the throne? If so, it would suggest a deep continuity of religious thought stretching back into the Bronze Age dawn. The artistry of the artifacts also speaks to a society of refinement and symbolic sophistication. Gold and silver ornaments were fashioned with skill, their designs reflecting not only wealth but also a cosmology where animals, sun, and divine symbols interwove. Standards crowned with stags and bulls suggest that the natural world was drawn directly into expressions of power and authority. The stag, often associated with fertility in the forest, may have stood as a mediator between realms, while the bull embodied raw strength and heavenly sanction. The discovery of these royal tombs reshaped understandings of Anatolia's prehistory. Before, the region was often thought of as a periphery to the great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, but the princely burials of Alakahoyuk revealed that Anatolia itself nurtured complex, hierarchical societies with their own traditions of kingship, wealth, and ritual. The Hittite Empire, when it arose centuries later, did not emerge from a cultural vacuum but inherited a deep-rooted legacy of sacred authority and symbolic kingship. Still, the tombs raise more questions than they answer. Why were so many animals sacrificed for a single burial? What rituals accompanied the sealing of these chambers? Were the sun discs meant to guide the soul into the afterlife, or to proclaim the eternal authority of the dynasty? And why did this early culture fade, leaving its treasures hidden until rediscovered in the modern age? Some scholars suggest that these princely elites may have been part of the Hatti people, a non-Indo-European population who inhabited central Anatolia before the arrival of the Indo-European speaking Hittites. The Hittites themselves later adopted the name of the land, Hatti, for their empire, even as their own language and culture grew distinct. If so, the tombs of Yazılıkaya stand as the ancestral bedrock upon which Hittite kingship was built, a silent dialogue between two civilizations across centuries. Walking among the excavated remains today, one can still feel the weight of this continuity. The walls of Yazılıkaya bear reliefs of processions, priests, and sacred animals, echoing the grandeur of the tombs below. Above ground, the ruins whisper of ceremony and ritual. Below, the tombs speak of a belief system where rulers bridge the human and the divine. Together, they sketch the outlines of a world whose influence lingered long after its names were forgotten. The treasures of Yazılıkaya are now preserved in museums, gleaming beneath glass, yet their meaning remains elusive. The gold discs, the bronze standards, the sacrificed animals all suggest a cosmology in which kingship was both earthly and cosmic, mortal and eternal. But without written records, we can only listen to echoes, piecing together fragments of a lost ideology. As the Hittite Empire rose, it would inherit not only the land of these ancient elites, but also their symbolic language. The bull, the stag, the sun, the sacrificial offering. Whether by direct descent or by cultural memory, the Hittites stood on foundations laid centuries before. The royal tombs of Yazılıkaya remain a reminder that beneath every empire lies an older lineage, an ancestral current flowing unseen beneath the surface of history. And so, as we leave the burial chambers in silence, questions linger. Were these rulers the forefathers of the Hittite kings, their sun discs lighting the path toward empire? Or were they strangers, their symbols adopted and reshaped by those who came after? The answers lie buried still, beneath Anatolia's soil, waiting for future hands to uncover. Chapter 9. The Indo-European Origins Debate. The Hittites occupy a unique place in the study of ancient civilizations. Not only were they among the great powers of the Late Bronze Age, but they also left behind the earliest recorded Indo-European language. Their cuneiform texts, pressed into clay more than 3,000 years ago, contain words and structures that resonate with later tongues spread across Europe and South Asia. To trace the Hittites is to confront the deeper question of origins. Where did they come from? And how did their language become the first written expression of a family that would one day stretch from Ireland to India? The Indo-European question has haunted scholars for more than 2 centuries. In the late 18th century, linguists first noticed the striking correspondences between Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, similarities too systematic to be dismissed as coincidence. Out of these observations arose the reconstruction of a hypothetical Proto-Indo-European tongue, the common ancestor of dozens of later languages. But reconstruction only sharpened the mystery. Where had this language been spoken, and how had it spread so widely? The discovery of Hittite texts in the early 20th century added a vital piece. Their archaic grammar and vocabulary confirmed that Indo-European roots stretched deeper into time than anyone had expected. The first decipherment of Hittite in 1915, Rosny, stunned the scholarly world. By recognizing words such as watar for water and ezatini for you eat, Rosny proved that the Hittite tongue was not only Indo-European, but also perhaps the most ancient attested branch. This raised new questions. Were the Hittites themselves migrants who had carried their language into Anatolia? Or were they part of a far older Indo-European homeland rooted in this very region? One major school of thought, often called the steppe hypothesis, traces Indo-European origins to the Pontic-Caspian steppes, a vast grassland zone north of the Black Sea. According to this model, around 4000–3000 BCE, pastoralist groups developed the domestication of the horse and the use of wheeled vehicles, enabling rapid expansions into Europe, Central Asia, and Anatolia. The Hittites, in this view, represent one early offshoot of these migrations, bringing their Indo-European tongue into Central Anatolia, where it blended with and eventually overtook the languages of the indigenous Hattians. Archaeological evidence has lent some weight to this model. The appearance of Kurgan-style burials, characteristic of steppe societies, and the spread of horse domestication and chariot technology suggest far-reaching movements of peoples. More recently, genetic studies have shown steppe-related ancestry appearing in Europe during the Bronze Age, consistent with large-scale migrations. The Hittites, then, may have been part of this wider wave, establishing themselves among older Anatolian populations and creating the fusion culture that would later dominate from Hattusa. But another school, the Anatolian hypothesis, argues differently. Proposed by Colin Renfrew and others, it places the Indo-European homeland not on the steppes, but in Anatolia itself, far earlier than the Bronze Age. According to this view, the spread of Indo-European languages was tied not to warlike migrations, but to the gradual diffusion of agriculture from Anatolia into Europe, beginning around 7000 BCE. The Hittites, in this scenario, were not migrants, but direct inheritors of an Indo-European tongue that had developed locally, deep within Anatolia's Neolithic cultures. Each hypothesis carries its strengths and weaknesses. The steppe model accounts for the dynamic expansion of Indo-European speaking peoples with mobility and new technologies, yet struggles to explain how Hittite diverged so early and in such an archaic form. The Anatolian model explains Hittite's antiquity, but raises questions about the mechanisms of language spread over such long time spans. Both theories rest on fragments of linguistic reconstruction, incomplete archaeological evidence, and the shifting data of ancient DNA. Neither has yet secured universal acceptance. What remains clear, however, is that the Hittites preserved traces of myths and rituals that resonate across the Indo-European world. The storm god battling the serpent Illuyanka echoes the Vedic hymn of Indra's combat with Vritra, and the Greek tale of Zeus against Typhon. Hittite ritual formulas contain parallels to archaic Indo-European prayers, with their invocation of divine order and sacrifice. Even linguistic echoes, the word for water, the terms for kinship, the roots of verbs, ripple outward into later languages. Through these fragile tablets, we hear the faint resonance of a shared heritage that would shape much of Eurasia's myth and speech. Yet the origins of the Hittites themselves remain elusive. Were they steppe migrants who imposed their language upon Anatolia's ancient Hattian lords, or were they the local heirs of an Indo-European tongue that had been rooted in Anatolia since the dawn of farming? The evidence does not yet allow us to choose definitively. What is certain is that the Hittites carried forward a linguistic and cultural bridge, one that connects the ruins of Hattusa to the hymns of the Vedas, the poems of Homer, and the speech of modern Europe and Asia. Standing among the ruins of their capital, one is reminded that empires fall, but languages endure in fragments. The Hittites vanished as a political power more than 3,000 years ago. Yet their words live on in the grammar of modern tongues. Their myths echo in the dragon slayers of legend. Their rituals whisper in the oldest prayers to the storm and the sun. The debate over their origins may never be fully settled, but perhaps that is fitting. For the story of the Hittites is not one of simple beginnings or endings, but of continuities stretched across millennia, a reminder that language itself is a kind of archaeology, carrying within it the buried past of forgotten peoples. The Hittites remain, then, both familiar and strange, the first voice of the Indo-European world, yet also a culture rooted in Anatolia's ancient soil. Their origins dissolve into mystery, leaving us only with questions and with echoes of words that still shape our tongues today. Chapter 10. Kadesh and the Old Assyrian Traders. Long before the lion-guarded gates of Hattusa rose in stone, another city pulsed with life upon the Anatolian plateau. Its name was Kadesh, known today as Kultepe, and in the early 2nd millennium BCE it was the beating heart of a commercial world. Here, merchants from distant Assur established colonies, carrying with them not only tin, textiles, and silver, but also the technology of writing itself. In Kadesh, the rhythms of trade and kinship, debt and dowry, flowed together, leaving behind thousands of clay tablets that still speak with remarkable intimacy across nearly 4,000 years. Excavations at Kultepe began in the 20th century, unearthing a treasure of archives unparalleled in their detail. Over 20,000 tablets have been recovered, many written in the old Assyrian dialect of Akkadian. Unlike the royal inscriptions of Mesopotamian kings, these are not monumental texts of conquest and pride. They are the correspondence of families and firms, ledgers of goods, letters between husbands and wives, contracts sealed with tiny clay envelopes. Together, they offer one of the most vivid glimpses of daily life in the Bronze Age. The merchants who traveled from Assur to Kadesh brought with them tin from the east, and fine textiles from Mesopotamia. These goods were exchanged for Anatolian silver and gold, weaving together a network of wealth that stretched across hundreds of miles. Caravans wound their way through mountain passes, laden with donkeys bearing heavy packs. Journeys could take weeks, even months, and the risks were considerable. Brigands, storms, and sudden political shifts threatened every venture. Yet the rewards were immense, and for generations the system flourished, binding Assyria and Anatolia in an enduring embrace. The tablets reveal more than trade. They reveal the personal ties that underpinned commerce. Wives in Assur wrote to their husbands in Kadesh, urging them to send silver home or chiding them for neglect. Sons reported to fathers on the progress of caravans. Disputes over dowries, inheritances, and partnerships were carefully documented. In one letter, a woman laments that her husband has not sent her enough silver to maintain the household. In another, a father advises his son on how best to negotiate with local Anatolian chiefs. These voices, preserved in clay, dissolve the distance of millennia and bring us into the living rooms of Bronze Age families. Kadesh was not merely a trading post, but a colony, known as a Karam, established under agreements with local Anatolian rulers. The Assyrians lived alongside the native population, intermarrying, adopting local customs, and influencing the politics of the region. Through them, the technology of cuneiform writing was introduced into Anatolia. What began as merchant bookkeeping would later be adopted by the Hittite kings for treaties, myths, and decrees. In this sense, Kadesh stands at the threshold of history, transforming oral traditions into written memory. The cultural exchange was complex. Assyrian merchants brought with them Mesopotamian gods and rituals, yet they also adapted to Anatolian traditions. Some texts reveal legal contracts sealed under the authority of local deities, reflecting a fusion of belief systems. Marriages between Assyrians and Anatolians were not uncommon, binding families across cultural lines. Out of such unions, new generations emerged who were neither wholly Assyrian nor wholly Anatolian, but heirs to a blended world. Archaeological layers at Kultepe suggest cycles of destruction and rebuilding. Fires consumed parts of the settlement, leaving behind charred tablets that nevertheless survived the centuries. Each destruction hints at the fragility of this trading network, vulnerable to conflict among local rulers or shifts in the balance of power. And yet, for nearly 2 centuries, the Assyrian presence endured, shaping the economic and cultural landscape of central Anatolia. The relationship between Kadesh and the rise of the Hittites is a subject of ongoing debate. Some scholars argue that the administrative skills and written practices introduced by the Assyrians laid the foundation for later Hittite statecraft. Others suggest that the Hittites emerged from entirely different traditions, absorbing Assyrian influences only indirectly. What is certain is that by the time the Hittite Empire crystallized in the 17th century BCE, writing, commerce, and diplomacy had already been tested in the crucible of Kadesh. Perhaps most intriguing is the intimacy of the tablets themselves. They do not speak in the voice of kings or generals, but of ordinary men and women negotiating the uncertainties of life. A wife's frustration with her absent husband, a merchant's anxiety over a delayed caravan, a partner's dispute over silver owed. These are the timeless concerns of human existence. Through them, Kadesh becomes more than an archaeological site. It becomes a community where we can still hear laughter, argument, and longing. Standing today at the mound of Kultepe, surrounded by quiet fields, it is difficult to imagine the bustling caravans that once converged here, the sound of donkeys braying under their loads, the scribes etching letters by lamplight. Yet beneath the soil lie thousands of voices that testify to a world already interconnected, already negotiating the balance of trust, risk, and reward. Kadesh was, in its time, both fragile and enduring. Fragile because a single fire could erase years of work. Enduring because its written words still speak across millennia. Whether the Hittites were direct heirs to this world or distant adopters of its practices, they inherited a land already shaped by networks of trade, by the discipline of writing, and by the mingling of cultures. As we leave Kadesh, we carry with us the sense of a world at once familiar and distant, a place where contracts and marriages, debts and promises were written into clay. Was this thriving network the seedbed of empire, or simply a foreign colony that left echoes in Anatolia's soil? The answer may lie buried still, waiting for further excavations. For now, the voices of Kadesh remain with us, whispering of a time before kings, when merchants and families carried the weight of civilization upon their shoulders. Chapter 11. The Rise of Hattusili. In the long shadows of the 17th century BCE, as Anatolia trembled with rival tribes and fractured kingdoms, a single figure began to gather the strands of power into his own hands. His name was Hattusili, remembered as the first great king of the Hittites, and from his stronghold at Hattusa, he would cast his ambition far beyond the hills of central Anatolia. His reign was one of expansion, conquest, and fragile consolidation, but it was also one of doubt, betrayal, and unresolved questions that would echo through Hittite history for centuries. The world into which Hattusili stepped was anything but stable. The lands of Anatolia were divided among local rulers and rival peoples. The Hattians, long settled in the region, the Hurrians, pressing from the east, the Amorites, establishing kingdoms to the south in Syria, and the looming presence of Mesopotamian powers, each vying for influence. Amid this unstable web, the city of Hattusa had only recently been destroyed by Hattusili's own predecessor, King Anita, who cursed the place and forbade its reoccupation. Yet it was precisely here, on the ruins of the cursed city, that Hattusili chose to plant the roots of his power. It was not merely a pragmatic choice of location. By reclaiming Hattusa, Hattusili both defied ancestral curses and made a symbolic claim that his dynasty would rise from destruction, asserting control where others had feared to dwell. The city itself, perched upon the high ridges of central Anatolia, offered strong natural defenses and commanding views over fertile valleys. From here, Hattusili would project power across mountains and plains, binding together disparate peoples into the first stirrings of an empire. We know of his reign not only through archaeology, but through the remarkable survival of his annals. These records, inscribed on clay tablets, offer a rare first-person voice from the ancient world. In them, Hattusili recounts his campaigns, not in the detached grandeur of later royal inscriptions, but in words that reveal ambition, frustration, and even self-doubt. He speaks of victories, but also of betrayals within his own household, of loyalty tested and broken, of the fragility of the state he was building. His campaigns carried him far beyond Anatolia. From Hattusa, he launched expeditions into the north against rival tribes, but his greatest ambitions lay to the south. The fertile crescent of northern Syria, with its wealthy Amorite cities, beckoned. It was a land that linked Anatolia to Mesopotamia, a crossroads of commerce and empire. To seize it was to announce the Hittites as a rising power in the international order of the Bronze Age. Hattusili's armies struck deep into Syrian territory, challenging cities such as Alalakh and clashing with the broader sphere of Mesopotamian influence. In these campaigns we see the first outlines of Hittite imperial policy. Ruthless conquest, combined with calculated diplomacy, destruction tempered by the planting of loyal governors. The Hittites did not simply raid and retreat. They sought to hold, to extract tribute, to incorporate distant lands into their expanding domain. Yet these victories came at a cost. Each new conquest stretched the fragile fabric of the Hittite state, demanding loyalty from vassals who were quick to rebel when the king's power faltered. Hattusili's annals speak of enemies who submitted one year, only to rise again the next. The empire was less a solid structure than a flame that had to be fed constantly, lest it flicker out. The greatest struggles, however, lay not on the battlefield but within Hattusili's own house. Lacking a secure line of succession, he adopted a grandson, naming him heir to the throne. But as the years passed, distrust grew. Whether through betrayal, disobedience, or political intrigue, the young heir fell from favor. In one of the most striking passages of his annals, Hattusili recounts how he disowned the child he had once raised as his successor. The tone is bitter, wounded, and uncertain. A king who had conquered cities and crushed armies, yet could not command loyalty within his own family. This conflict over succession was not an isolated episode. It was the beginning of a pattern that would haunt the Hittite monarchy for generations. Unlike the stable dynasties of Egypt, the Hittites struggled repeatedly with contested heirs, rival claimants, and bloody coups. The seed of this instability can be traced back to Hattusili himself, whose final years were consumed not by triumph, but by the question of who would inherit his fragile creation. His legacy, however, cannot be measured only in terms of family strife. By the end of his reign, Hattusili had transformed a small Anatolian kingdom into a regional power with ambitions that reached into Syria and beyond. He had chosen Hattusa as his capital, setting the stage for centuries of imperial rule from that place. He had demonstrated that the Hittites could contend with the great powers of the age, from Mesopotamia to the Levant. And yet, his own words betray an unease. In his final testament, Hattusili reflects on his deeds, his victories, and his failures. He speaks as a man aware that empires rest on fragile foundations, that loyalty cannot be guaranteed, that even the mightiest conqueror must one day hand his legacy to others. The figure who emerges from the tablets is not a distant, unapproachable monarch, but a man of flesh and doubt, burdened by the weight of kingship. Today, as archaeologists unearth the ruins of Hattusa and scholars pore over the cracked lines of his annals, we hear Hattusili's voice across the gulf of millennia. It is the voice of a founder, but also of a man caught between ambition and uncertainty. He laid the cornerstone of an empire, but in doing so, he also exposed the fractures that would run through Hittite politics for centuries to come. The rise of Hattusili. I was both the beginning of greatness and the beginning of struggle. His conquests opened the path to empire, but his doubts, betrayals, and broken succession planted questions that were never fully answered. As we turn from his reign, we do so with a sense of paradox, that the very birth of Hittite power was shadowed by the seeds of its eventual decline. The stones of Hattusa still whisper his name, half in triumph, half in warning. And in those whispers, we are reminded that the founding of empires is never pure victory, but always mingled with fragility, doubt, and the silent weight of what is yet to come. Chapter 12. The Edict of Telepinu. The 16th century before the Common Era, amid the turbulence of assassination and rebellion, a king of the Hittites did something extraordinary. His name was Telepinu, and instead of carving only triumphs into stone, he chose to memorialize the bloodshed that had brought him to the throne. The document he left behind is known to us as the Edict of Telepinu. It is not a hymn of victory, nor a prayer to the gods. It is a sober, almost desperate attempt to bring order to chaos, to fix the rules of kingship in a world where thrones were taken as often as they were inherited. The edict begins not with law, but with memory. Telepinu looks back across the generations, recounting the rise of the dynasty from the time of Labana, the legendary founder. He lists conquests, victories, and prosperity, but swiftly the tone shifts. He names the betrayals, the murders, the sons who slew fathers, the brothers who turned against brothers. He speaks of kings struck down not by foreign enemies, but by their own kin, of queens and princes cut down in struggles for power. Where most rulers sought to erase the shame of civil war, Telepinu recited it openly, placing the dynasty's darkest moments into permanent record. Why would a king do this? The question lingers even now. Was it an act of political courage, a bid to remind the nobility of the terrible cost of their feuds? Or was it an act of desperation, a ruler so besieged by factional strife that only public confession might restore the throne's dignity? After the history comes the law. Telepinu laid down a new system of succession. The kingship, he declared, should pass first to a legitimate son. If no son survived, the throne would go to a brother. Failing that, to the children of a brother or sister. The rules were carefully enumerated, step by step, as if to leave no room for ambiguity, no opening for the violence that had plagued the past. The aim was continuity, a chain of inheritance that could not be broken by ambition. The edict also placed limits upon the royal household itself. Queens, who in earlier times wielded great political influence, were now bound more tightly within the structure of succession. Court officials and military leaders, who had too often been the hands that carried out palace murders, were warned against interfering in dynastic matters. The throne, Telepinu insisted, belonged by right to the royal line, not to the strongest conspirator. Archaeologists first uncovered copies of the edict on clay tablets in the archives of Hattusa. Written in the Hittite tongue with the borrowed cuneiform script, the text reads less like a boastful proclamation and more like a legal treatise. Its tone is stern, pragmatic, stripped of the poetic grandeur that characterizes many royal inscriptions. This is what makes it so unusual. It is a king speaking not as a conqueror, but as a reformer, almost a legislator, attempting to bind the future with words. But law is fragile, when set against ambition. Even with the edict in place, Hittite history did not become free of intrigue. Assassinations and usurpations continued, for power is rarely restrained by parchment or clay. Yet the very existence of the edict testifies to a deep awareness within the Hittite state that memory itself could be a tool of governance. By recounting the dynasty's past, Telepinu was not merely setting rules. He was framing the narrative of kingship, shaping how future generations would understand their own legitimacy. To read the edict today is to hear a voice at once ancient and startlingly modern. Telepinu acknowledges failure, names corruption, and insists on transparency, qualities rarely associated with Bronze Age monarchs. But the document is also deeply political. By confessing the sins of his predecessors, Telepinu set himself apart as the one who would restore order. In this sense, the edict is both an indictment and a manifesto, a weapon wielded not on the battlefield, but in the contested arena of memory. Historians still debate its deeper meaning. Was Telepinu truly reform-minded, hoping to tame the violence of the court? Or was he simply consolidating his own power, using the language of justice to weaken rival factions? The text does not tell us his motives, only his words. What it does reveal is the fragility of kingship in the ancient Near East, where power was not a stable inheritance, but a prize fought over in palace corridors. The edict also offers rare historical detail. Without it, much of the early history of the Hittite dynasty would be lost. Telepinu's insistence on recording assassinations and conspiracies preserved names and events that no propagandist would otherwise have allowed to survive. Ironically, in seeking to stabilize his reign, he granted us one of the most precious narratives of Hittite origins. His voice, though framed as law, became history's witness. When we place the edict beside the annals of kings like Hattusa, we see the two faces of Hittite rule. One face turned outward toward conquest and expansion, the other turned inward toward the hidden struggles that threatened to tear the state apart from within. If Hattusa gave the Hittites their empire, Telepinu tried to give them continuity. Both struggled with forces larger than themselves, ambition, fear, and the relentless pull of human rivalry. Standing in the ruins of Hattusa today, one can imagine the moment when the edict was first proclaimed. The court gathered in silence, the nobles listening as the king recited both glory and blood, reminding them of the price of discord. The clay tablets were pressed and sealed, stored in archives, as if words alone could anchor the future. Did the audience believe him? Did they truly commit to peace? Or did they simply wait, biding their time until the next chance for power presented itself? The silence of history cannot answer. What it does give us is the text itself. The Edict of Telepinu, a fragile monument, not of stone or bronze, but of reflection. It tells us that even in the Bronze Age, rulers understood that memory could be as powerful as the sword. It also tells us that memory could wound, for to recall the dynasty's bloodshed was to remind every noble of the dangerous precedent already set. In the end, Telepinu's edict remains a paradox. It is both law and lament, both a promise of order and a confession of weakness. It reveals a king who sought legitimacy not only through divine sanction or military might, but through narrative, through the careful telling of history. And in that telling, he left behind one of the rarest gifts from antiquity, an unguarded glimpse of monarchy looking at itself. As the voice of Telepinu fades, we are left with the uneasy sense that law cannot silence ambition, and that even the most candid words may not avert the violence of power. Yet the edict endures, a clay-bound reminder that the struggle for stability was as old as the kingship itself, and as fragile as the line of succession it sought to protect. Chapter 13. The Conquests of Superpower. In the 14th century before the Common Era, a single ruler reshaped the destiny of the Hittite kingdom. His name was Superpower I, a king whose brilliance as a strategist and ambition as a conqueror lifted his people from the shadows of decline to the rank of superpower. For decades before his reign, the Hittites had wavered, their empire weakened by rival dynasties and the rising strength of neighbors to the south and east. But with Superpower, the story changed. His conquests extended the reach of Hatti across Syria, overturned the balance of power in the Near East, and set his name among the most formidable rulers of the Late Bronze Age. We know him not only through the echo of ruins, but through the annals inscribed in clay. His own words, recorded in the archives of Hattusa, speak of campaigns against rebellious cities, victories over rivals, and the treaties that followed. These records are fragmentary, yet together they reveal the image of a king restless, decisive, and unrelenting. Suppiluliuma was not content with survival. He sought dominion. His first great target was northern Syria, a land of fortified cities and long-contested trade routes. There, the ancient kingdom of Mitanni had once held sway, but internal weakness left it vulnerable. Suppiluliuma struck with precision. He captured Carchemish, Aleppo, and other cities that commanded the roads between Anatolia and the Levant. Each conquest secured not only territory, but also wealth, caravans of goods, tribute from princes, and access to the vital flow of trade that linked Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. Yet conquest in the ancient world was never merely military. Suppiluliuma proved himself a master of diplomacy as well as war. In dealing with Mitanni, he did not simply destroy, he subjugated. By marrying his son into the Mitannian royal line, he transformed a defeated kingdom into a vassal ally. This act of political marriage brought the once mighty Mitanni under Hittite influence, securing the eastern flank of his empire and denying rivals the chance to rise again. In the south, another power watched uneasily: Egypt. For centuries, the pharaohs had extended their reach into Canaan, claiming dominion over the cities of the Levant. Now, with Suppiluliuma's armies pressing from the north, Egypt's grip began to falter. Battles and negotiations stretched across decades. While a direct clash between Suppiluliuma and Pharaoh may never have come, the tension reshaped the political map. Vassal states that had once sworn loyalty to Egypt now shifted their allegiance to Hatti. The Levant became a contested frontier, its cities caught between two great empires. One episode reveals just how far Suppiluliuma's power had reached. The Amarna letters, a cache of Egyptian diplomatic correspondence, preserve the words of a widow of Pharaoh, known only as Dakamunzu in the Hittite version of the tale. With her husband dead, she wrote to Suppiluliuma, asking for one of his sons as her husband so that he might become king of Egypt. Such a request was without precedent, a queen of Egypt appealing to a foreign ruler to provide a pharaoh. Suppiluliuma hesitated, suspicious of treachery, but ultimately sent his son Zananza south. He never arrived. Egyptian factions, perhaps unwilling to accept a foreign prince, cut him down before he reached the throne. The episode ended in tragedy, but it reveals the stature Suppiluliuma had attained. Egypt itself, long the arbiter of power, now looked northward in desperation. The Hittites stood as equals, rivals on the world stage. But greatness carries shadows. Among the captives brought back from Suppiluliuma's Syrian campaigns, there came an invisible enemy. A plague spread through the Hittite lands, devastating the population. The king himself fell victim. The records speak of the sorrow that followed. Suppiluliuma dead, his sons stricken, the land in mourning. What had been a triumph of arms turned into a disaster of disease. The very conquests that expanded the empire carried within them the seeds of suffering. The annals of his reign embody the paradox of empire. Suppiluliuma secured victories that seemed eternal. Cities captured, vassals subdued, rivals humbled. Yet within a generation, much of what he built was imperiled, undone by forces no general could command. The plague weakened the kingdom at the very moment it needed strength, leaving his successors to struggle against both foreign enemies and the memory of their father's greatness. Archaeology gives us glimpses of this world. At Carchemish, at Aleppo, at Hattusa itself, inscriptions and artifacts testify to the breadth of Hittite control. In treaties written on clay tablets, we read the language of obligation, vassal kings swearing loyalty, promising tribute, binding their cities to the throne of Hatti. In letters exchanged with Egypt and Assyria, we see the recognition of the Hittites as an empire among empires. This was the age when Hatti rose from a regional kingdom to a superpower whose influence reached from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Canaan. Yet questions remain. Did Suppiluliuma's ambition overextend the resources of his people? Was the plague a natural calamity, or the consequence of prisoners of war spreading unfamiliar diseases? Could his sons ever hope to hold together the vast domains he had conquered? The silence of history offers no easy answers. What is certain is that Suppiluliuma, or Awareness, changed the course of the Near East. His name stands alongside the great kings of his age, Amenhotep and Akhenaten in Egypt, Tushratta in Mitanni, Ashur-uballit in Assyria. He is remembered as the ruler who lifted the Hittites to glory, but also as the king whose triumphs were shadowed by catastrophe. Standing amid the ruins of Hattusa, one can almost hear the echo of his victories, the march of armies, the cries of envoys swearing oaths of fealty. Yet alongside them, one can also sense the silence of loss, the whisper of a plague that no army could withstand. Suppiluliuma's reign is thus not a simple tale of conquest, but a meditation on the fragility of power, the cost of ambition, and the unforeseen consequences of greatness. As his story fades into the mists of time, we are left with the paradox he embodies: a king who brought his people to the height of empire and at the same time to the brink of calamity. His legacy endures not only in the stones of conquered cities, but in the lesson that every triumph carries within it the shadow of its undoing. Chapter 14. The Amarna Letters and the Egyptian Queen's Plea. Among the most extraordinary documents of the ancient world lies a plea, intimate, desperate, and almost unthinkable, preserved on clay tablets in the royal archives of Egypt. The Amarna Letters record the diplomacy of the late Bronze Age. Envoys bargaining for alliances, vassals reporting their loyalty, kings writing to kings. But hidden among these official exchanges is a startling voice, that of an Egyptian queen, recently widowed and facing a crisis of survival. Her words, written not in Egyptian hieroglyphs, but in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age, traveled north across deserts and mountains to the court of the Hittite king, Suppiluliuma Omai. She addressed him with a request so audacious it has echoed across history. They say you have many sons. If you give me one of them, he shall become my husband. I will not take a servant of mine and make him my husband. The queen is known in the Hittite archives as Dakamunzu, a rendering of the Egyptian phrase Tahemet Nesu, the king's wife. Many scholars identify her as Ankhesenamun, the young widow of Tutankhamun. Others have proposed Nefertiti herself, or another royal consort. Whoever she was, her words reveal fear and vulnerability. Fear of being forced to marry below her station, fear of losing her power, and perhaps fear for her very life. Why would the Queen of Egypt, daughter of the greatest dynasty on earth, reach out to a foreign rival? The Amarna Letters suggest that Egypt stood at a moment of weakness. The Amarna period had been one of upheaval. Akhenaten's religious revolution had unsettled the kingdom, and Tutankhamun's death left the throne without a strong heir. The queen's appeal to Suppiluliuma reveals not only her desperation, but the scale of Hittite power. For the first time, Egypt looked north to its enemy and saw not just a rival, but a savior. Suppiluliuma, cautious but intrigued, did not accept the proposal at once. He sent envoys to confirm the queen's words. When her reply came back, equally insistent, equally desperate, he agreed. He chose his son, Prince Zananza, and dispatched him on the perilous journey south, escorted by guards and attendants, bearing the weight of dynastic ambition. Had Zananza reached Thebes, the ancient world might have been transformed. A Hittite prince on the throne of Egypt would have united two great powers under one house. The balance of the Near East, already fragile, might have tilted irreversibly in Hittite favor. Instead, the journey ended in blood. Near the borders of Egypt, Zananza was killed. The details are lost, but the Hittite annals preserve Suppiluliuma's fury. He accused the Egyptians of treachery, denouncing their queen in her court for the murder of his son. Whether the killing was ordered by a faction within Egypt, by General Horemheb, or by the ambitious courtier Ai, who would himself take the throne, we cannot know. What is certain is that the chance for a Hittite pharaoh vanished in an instant, replaced by bitterness and vengeance. The aftermath was grim. Suppiluliuma unleashed his armies upon Egyptian vassals in Syria, seizing cities and captives in retaliation. But among those captives, as the records tell us, came the plague, the very disease that would sweep through Hatti, killing thousands, and eventually claiming Suppiluliuma himself. Thus, the Queen's Plea not only ended in tragedy, but also set in motion a chain of events that destabilized the Hittite kingdom. The episode remains one of the great enigmas of ancient history. Why did the Queen place her trust in a rival king? Was she truly Ankhesenamun, left defenseless after Tutankhamun's death? Did Egyptian generals fear the shame of a foreign ruler ascending the throne? Or was the entire scheme doomed from the start, a desperate gamble in a moment of chaos? Archaeology gives us glimpses but not certainty. The Amarna letters provide the words, the Hittite annals record the outrage, but the queen's own fate remains veiled. After her last message, she vanishes from history. Some believe she was forced to marry A, the aging courtier who seized the throne. Others think she was silenced altogether. What endures is the drama of her voice, carried across hundreds of miles, echoing through 3 millennia. In that moment, the boundary between Egypt and Hatti seemed fragile, the future of empires balanced on the fate of one young woman and one prince. Their story reveals the deep entanglement of power and vulnerability, of ambition and betrayal, that shaped the late Bronze Age. The plea of Dakamunzu stands as a singular testimony, an Egyptian queen seeking salvation in the arms of her enemies, and a Hittite prince whose march toward destiny ended in assassination. It is a story of what might have been, a lost union, a murdered heir, a world forever changed by a message written in clay. Chapter 15. The Battle of Kadesh. The year was 1274 BCE. The place, the plains of Kadesh, a fortress city on the banks of the Orontes River, guarding the approaches to Syria. Here, under the glare of the Levantine sun, the armies of two great powers collided, the Hittite kingdom under King Muwatalli II and Egypt under Pharaoh Ramesses II. It is remembered as one of the most famous battles of the ancient world. Chariots roared across the dust, thousands of warriors surged in ordered ranks, and the fate of empires seemed to tremble in the balance. But when the dust settled, no clear victor could claim the field. Egypt told of triumph, Hatti of strategy fulfilled, and in between lay the murky truth, wrapped in the shadows of propaganda. The confrontation was long in the making. For decades, Egypt and Hatti had vied for control of Syria. The coastal cities, with their harbors and trade, the inland routes that carried goods from Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean, these were the prizes. Kadesh itself had changed hands more than once. Its allegiance could tip the balance of power across the entire Levant. By the 13th century BCE, both superpowers were unwilling to compromise. Ramesses II, young and ambitious, sought glory early in his reign. Determined to reclaim Kadesh and reassert Egyptian dominance, he raised a mighty army, said to number over 20,000 men, divided into 4 divisions, Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. Each bore the name of a god, and together they formed one of the largest forces Egypt had ever assembled. Muwatalli, aware of Egypt's advance, gathered allies from across Anatolia and northern Syria. The Hittite army was a coalition, reinforced by vassals and mercenaries, its numbers swollen perhaps to 40,000, nearly double that of Ramesses. Among them were the famed Hittite charioteers, heavier and more powerful than those of Egypt, capable of carrying 3 warriors instead of 2. In them lay Hatti's greatest advantage. The 2 armies converged near Kadesh, each maneuvering along the Orontes. Egyptian accounts, carved into temple walls at Abu Simbel, Luxor, and Karnak, tell us that Ramesses' scouts were deceived by Hittite spies. Believing the Hittites far away, he advanced rashly, stretching out his divisions along the road. When the division of Amun encamped near Kadesh, Ramesses discovered, too late, that the main Hittite force lay hidden behind the city's walls. Then came the ambush. The Hittite chariots surged forth in a thunder of wheels and hooves, crashing into the isolated Egyptian division. Panic swept through the camp. Egyptian soldiers scattered, tents collapsed, and the Hittites carved a swath of destruction. Ramesses himself, in the Egyptian account, is said to have fought with godlike valor, rallying his men, striking down foes, and calling upon Amun for strength. Yet the battle was not decided. The remaining Egyptian divisions arrived, turning the tide. The Hittites, having pressed their charge too deep, lost cohesion. The Egyptian counterattack forced them back toward the river. By day's end, neither side could claim the city, and neither had destroyed the other's army. What happened at Kadesh depends on whose story you believe. Ramesses' inscriptions, repeated across Egypt's temples, declare an overwhelming victory, portraying the pharaoh as the sole savior of his army, a warrior without equal. The reliefs show him alone in his chariot, bow taut, scattering the Hittites before him. These images became the great propaganda of Egypt, a performance of triumph carved into stone. But the Hittite records suggest another perspective. For Muwatalli, the battle was no disaster. Kadesh remained under Hittite control, and the Egyptians were forced to withdraw south. In the end, Egypt did not gain the prize it had sought, and Syria remained in Hatti's orbit. From this vantage, the Hittites could claim a strategic success, holding the ground that mattered. Between these competing narratives lies the deeper truth. Kadesh was a stalemate. Neither empire was strong enough to overwhelm the other. Each claimed glory, but both were forced to confront their limits. The battle also reveals the changing nature of warfare in the Late Bronze Age. Chariots dominated the field, no longer mere vehicles for aristocrats but platforms for massed combat. The Egyptian chariots, lighter and swifter, darted across the field, while the Hittite machines, larger and heavier, drove forward with crushing force. On that day, two visions of battle collided, and neither proved decisive. The aftermath stretched beyond the battlefield. Ramesses continued to boast of victory, and for Egyptians, the story of Kadesh became a touchstone of Pharaoh's might. Yet in practical terms, the war dragged on, consuming resources and lives. It was only years later, after further clashes and the weariness of both empires, that peace was sought. From the ashes of Kadesh emerged the world's first known written peace treaty, inscribed in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform. Copies survive still, one in Istanbul, another in Cairo, and a replica at the United Nations headquarters in New York. Its words speak of brotherhood between kings, of mutual defense, and of an end to hostilities. The treaty transformed Kadesh from a symbol of rivalry into a testament of diplomacy. And yet, the question remains, did Ramesses truly win? Or was Kadesh a masterstroke of Hittite cunning, a trap that nearly shattered Egypt's army? The inscriptions do not agree, and the soil of Kadesh yields no answer. What survives is the paradox of the battle itself. Remembered as one of history's great clashes, yet resolving little, a monument less to triumph than to the delicate balance of empires. As the chariot wheels fade into silence and the Orontes flows on, Kadesh lingers in memory as both glory and warning. It reminds us that even the mightiest kings could not bend the world entirely to their will, and that power, once tested, often reveals its own fragility. Chapter 16. The Eternal Peace Treaty. In the wake of the clash at Kadesh, the world did not settle. Armies marched again across Syria. Emissaries rode between courts, and the fragile balance of power held in tension. The Hittite king Hattusa III, who had seized the throne after internal struggles, sought not only to secure his crown, but to safeguard his realm from enemies abroad. On the Egyptian throne sat Ramesses II, the same pharaoh who had once carved images of his supposed triumph at Kadesh deep into the stone of his temples. For years their rivalry had strained the Near East. But now, necessity turned rivals into partners. Around 1259 BCE, more than a decade after the battle, the two empires chose a different weapon, not the chariot, but the treaty. On tablets of silver, precious metal that itself signified permanence, scribes inscribed what the ancient world would later remember as the eternal peace. It was not written in secrecy. It was proclaimed, displayed, and copied in both languages. Akkadian cuneiform for the Hittites, Egyptian hieroglyphs for the pharaoh. Two voices, two alphabets, bound together in the same covenant. The words are startling in their clarity. They speak of peace, of fraternity, of recognition between kings who had once stood opposed on the battlefield. There shall be no hostilities between them forever, the treaty declares. But behind the ideal lies the shadow of necessity. The Hittites, threatened on their northern frontiers by restless tribes, needed to guard their southern flank. Egypt, weary of prolonged campaigns in Syria and mindful of internal stability, sought security rather than endless war. The treaty did more than halt conflict. It pledged mutual defense. If one king were attacked, the other was bound to aid him. If fugitives fled across borders, they were to be returned with protection. In this we glimpse the anxieties of two powers aware of their own fragility. Alliances could shift, vassals could rebel, and the great empires of the Late Bronze Age were surrounded by forces beyond their control. The eternal peace was less a celebration of friendship than a pact for survival. Archaeology preserves both sides of the story. At Hattusa, fragments of the treaty in cuneiform were unearthed, their wedge-shaped characters pressed into clay copies of the original silver tablet. In Egypt, the hieroglyphic version was carved into the walls of Karnak, and the Ramesseum, where Rameses ensured that generations would remember his hand in securing peace. Today, a replica of this treaty hangs in the United Nations headquarters in New York, a symbol drawn across 3 millennia of humanity's yearning for order amid chaos. Yet the silver that once carried these words is gone. No complete tablet survives, only echoes on clay and stone. Was the eternal peace ever more than fragile parchment in metal form? History suggests otherwise. Within decades, new powers stirred. The sea peoples on the Mediterranean coasts, Assyria pressing from the east. The Hittite Empire itself would collapse around 1200 BCE. Its cities burned, its archives silenced. Egypt too would falter, entering a long decline. The treaty's eternity was measured not in centuries, but in decades. Still, the text endures as a rare glimpse into diplomacy before the Classical Age. Most treaties of the Bronze Age have vanished, their terms forgotten. Here, we see the careful language of compromise. The great king of Egypt is in brotherhood with the great king of Hatti. The rhetoric elevates both rulers to equal stature, neither conceding supremacy. For Rameses, this was a subtle retreat. He, who had once proclaimed Kadesh as a total victory, now signed words that placed Egypt on the same plane as Hatti. For Hattusili, who had taken the throne by force, the treaty offered legitimacy, enshrined by Egypt's recognition. Each gained what they needed most. And beyond the kings themselves, the treaty reflects the wider world of late Bronze diplomacy. Marriages sealed alliances, gifts of gold and ivory passed between courts, and letters carried formal greetings across deserts and seas. Peace was not the absence of rivalry, but the weaving of a web strong enough to hold the rivalries in check. One clause of the treaty still resonates, its appeal to the gods as witnesses. The pantheons of both peoples, the storm gods and sun deities of Anatolia, the sky fathers and river spirits of Egypt, were invoked to punish any who would break the covenant. To seal peace was not merely a political act, it was a sacred oath inscribed into the cosmos itself. Yet even divine guarantees could not protect empires from the unraveling to come. The eternal peace has been called the world's first international treaty. Whether it was truly the first we cannot know, for countless others may have crumbled into dust. But it remains the first whose words we can still read, the first to stretch its voice across thousands of years into our present. Its survival is as symbolic as its signing, fragile, partial, but enduring. And so we stand in the ruins of Hattusa, where copies of the treaty were once kept in royal archives, and we read alongside the hieroglyphs of Egypt carved into temple stone. We hear in their echo not triumph, not conquest, but compromise, a recognition that even the mightiest kingdoms of the Bronze Age needed peace as much as war. Was this peace an achievement of vision, or merely a pause before collapse? Did it embody the dream of stability, or the desperation of kings surrounded by enemies? The silver tablets have vanished, the empires have fallen, and yet the words remain, suspended between history and memory, a fragile promise of eternity. Chapter 17, Queen Puduhepa and the Hittite Courtimid, the shifting balance of empires. Where kings measured their power in campaigns and treaties, a woman's voice rose with clarity from the Anatolian plateau. Her name was Puduhepa, Queen of the Hittites, consort of Hattusili III. Yet she was not merely a queen in ceremonial title. She was a priestess turned monarch, a stateswoman whose words traveled across deserts and mountains, etched into clay tablets that still carry her presence. Her beginnings were far from the throne. Puduhepa was born in Kitzuwatna, a region at the southern edge of the Hittite world, where Anatolian traditions blended with Hurrian influence. There she served as a priestess of Ishtar, goddess of love and war. In this role, she learned the rituals of sacrifice, the power of incantation, and the intricate threads that bound divine authority to earthly rule. It was during the campaigns of Hattusili that fate drew their paths together. Struck, it is said, by her beauty and wisdom, he took her as his wife, a union not of fleeting romance but of enduring partnership. From the moment she entered the court of Hattusa, Puduhepa became more than consort. She became counselor, advisor, and at times co-ruler. In a world where most queens are shadows behind kings, her hand appears unmistakably in the records. Letters addressed to foreign courts bear not only the seal of Hattusili but her own. She corresponded directly with Pharaoh Rameses II and his queen, Nefertari, exchanging greetings and affirmations of alliance. In the peace forged between Hatti and Egypt, her presence is undeniable. A queen speaking across borders with the authority of a king. Archaeology has preserved her voice with startling intimacy. More than 100 clay tablets bear her words. Some deal with diplomacy, others with religion, others with the management of her household estates. Through them, we glimpse her personality, sharp, pragmatic, unafraid to assert herself in matters of international weight. When the Egyptians hesitated in honoring treaty terms, it was Puduhepa who reminded them of their commitments. Her tone firm yet dignified. In this, she appears not as a mere mediator, but as an equal in the great dialogue of empires. Her influence reached deep into the sacred life of the Hittites. Drawing on her priestly background, she reorganized cultic practices, clarifying the hierarchy of gods, integrating Hurrian deities into the Hittite pantheon, and strengthening the bond between throne and temple. Under her guidance, the worship of the goddess Hebat, identified with Ishtar, took on renewed prominence, balanced against the storm god Teshub. The religious reforms she championed were not marginal. They stabilized the spiritual framework of the empire at a moment when cohesion was vital. Even her domestic role extended far beyond the private sphere. Puduhepa managed vast estates, commanded servants, and oversaw the upbringing of royal children. In one letter, she negotiates marriage alliances, treating princes and princesses as pieces on the diplomatic board. Through her, dynastic strategy took shape, weaving kinship into the fabric of foreign policy. It is no wonder that scholars debate whether she was the silent power behind the throne or a co-ruler in her own right. The evidence suggests she was both, confidant and partner, yet also sovereign in authority. What is most striking is how her words reveal a woman unbound by the silence that cloaks so many queens of antiquity. We hear her reminding foreign rulers of obligations, asserting the dignity of her office, and invoking the will of the gods to legitimize Hittite positions. In the correspondence with Nefertari of Egypt, she appears as a sister queen, not merely as a wife writing on behalf of her husband. The tone is one of shared stature, of women at the pinnacle of empires, acknowledging one another across the chasm of distance. Her presence raises larger questions about the Hittite court itself. Was Hattusa unique in granting queens such authority, or was Puduhepa an extraordinary exception? Earlier queens, such as Tawananna, held ceremonial roles, but Puduhepa seems to have transformed that role into an office of genuine power. The very survival of her words across a century of fire and collapse suggests her contemporaries recognized her importance. Clay, after all, preserves only what scribes were ordered to inscribe. And yet the full contours of her life remain shadowed. We do not know her thoughts beyond the formal words of statecraft. We cannot hear the private conversations with Hattusili, where doubt and decision mingled in the quiet of night. We see only the traces of her hand in matters of diplomacy, religion, and law. But even these traces are enough to remind us that the story of empire was not told by kings alone. In the closing years of her life, as the Hittite Empire faced new threats from without and unease from within, Puduhepa continued her work. She stood at the center of ceremonies, advised her children, and maintained correspondence with Egypt. Her legacy was not a monument of stone, but a corpus of words pressed into clay. They endure as a rare testament to a woman who shaped the fate of nations. Today, when we walk the ruins of Hattusa, we hear echoes of kings, Hattusili, Muwatalli, Supilululiuma, but hidden among those echoes is the voice of a queen, steady and resonant, reminding us that power in the ancient world could be shared, if only briefly, across the boundaries of gender. Was Puduhepa the unseen architect of Hittite diplomacy, or the visible embodiment of a shared throne? Was she a figure elevated by circumstance, or one who reshaped the very role of queenship? The clay tablets refuse to answer fully. They leave us with fragments, with glimpses of a woman who rose from priestess to sovereign, who stood before gods and kings alike. And in those fragments, her presence lingers, a queen whose voice still whispers through the dust of Anatolia. Chapter 18, The Laws of the Hittites. In the archives of Hattusa, written on clay tablets in neat cuneiform lines, lies a voice not of kings or conquests, but of rules, judgments, and the fabric of daily life. These are the laws of the Hittites, a collection that offers us not battles, but the quiet architecture of society, where Hammurabi's famous Code of Babylon thunders with death sentences and divine retribution. The Hittite laws breathe with a different spirit, pragmatic, Flexible, more concerned with balance than with terror. The laws, preserved in several versions dating from the 17th to the 13th centuries BCE, were inscribed on clay and stored in royal archives. They cover a wide range of subjects: property rights, theft, sexual conduct, marriage, divorce, inheritance, slavery, and even the treatment of livestock and domestic animals. Their language is simple and practical, less poetic than the Babylonian prologues, but perhaps more revealing of lived reality. They do not present themselves as divine revelation handed down from on high. Instead, they read as a record of decisions, tested, amended, and adapted as society evolved. One of the most striking features of these laws is their relative moderation. Where Hammurabi's code would impose death for theft, the Hittite system often required restitution. The thief must return what was taken and compensate the victim. Even serious crimes, such as certain forms of assault or adultery, were often met not with execution, but with fines, enslavement, or compensation in silver. It was a system that sought not the spectacle of punishment, but the restoration of balance. Consider the treatment of violence. If a man injured another in a brawl, the laws prescribed a payment in silver, scaled to the nature of the wound. The emphasis was not on retribution, but on making the victim whole. Homicide, too, was addressed with nuance. In some cases, the killer could escape execution by paying compensation to the victim's family. To modern readers, this may appear unjust, but in the world of the late Bronze Age, it reveals a society more concerned with maintaining peace among families and clans than with satisfying abstract ideals of justice. The laws also shed light on marriage and family life. Women had recognized rights in matters of property and inheritance, though within the clear bounds of patriarchal order. Marriage contracts could be dissolved, and provisions for dowry and divorce are carefully detailed. Slavery, too, was regulated, though it was far from abolished. Slaves could own property, marry, and in some cases purchase their own freedom. These glimpses do not reveal equality, but they do reveal complexity. A society attentive to the ties that bound people together, even across divisions of class. Perhaps most remarkable is the care given to animals. The laws detail compensation for the injury or theft of cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses. They regulate the treatment of oxen used in ploughing, prescribing payments if the animals were harmed through negligence. In this, we glimpse a society where wealth was measured not only in silver, but in living herds, and where the well-being of animals was bound into the rhythm of survival. Why this moderation, when their neighbors embraced harsher codes? Some scholars suggest it was shaped by the frontier realities of Anatolia. The Hittite kingdom was a patchwork of peoples and traditions, with diverse laws inherited from Hurrian, Hattian, and Indo-European roots. A rigid system of terror might have fractured such a society. Flexibility allowed it to endure. Others argue it reflects a cultural ethos, a recognition that stability was best preserved not by fear, but by negotiated order. The very structure of the laws supports this view. They are not fixed commandments, but living texts. Over centuries, older provisions were edited, softened, or clarified. For example, in earlier versions of the laws, certain sexual crimes carried the death penalty, but in later copies, these were reduced to fines or enslavement. Such revisions suggest an evolving legal consciousness, a willingness to adapt as circumstances changed. The laws were not sacred in the sense of being immutable. They were tools, recalibrated across generations to maintain equilibrium. And yet, the laws also reveal hierarchy. Not all lives were valued equally. Compensation for injury or death could vary depending on the status of victim and offender. Slaves were worth less in silver than free men, and women were often treated as property within marriage contracts. Justice in Hattusa was practical, but it was not impartial. Like all ancient systems, it reflected the structures of power that defined its society. Archaeology gives us only fragments of the courtrooms where these laws were applied. We do not see the faces of the judges, nor hear the pleas of plaintiffs and defendants, but we can imagine disputes over stolen cattle, quarrels over inheritance, accusations of infidelity whispered into the halls of power. In these everyday conflicts, the great edifice of empire found its foundation. The empire might have stretched across Anatolia and Syria, but its true cohesion depended not only on kings and armies, but on ordinary men and women who believed that disputes could be settled by law rather than endless vendetta. The tablets of law are, in this sense, monuments as important as any temple or fortress. They show us a society wrestling with the eternal challenge of justice, how to punish without destroying, how to restore without surrendering authority. And they remind us that even in an age of chariots and conquest, the true measure of order lay in the invisible bonds of compensation, agreement, and obligation. What then do the Hittite laws tell us about the people who lived under them? They reveal a society that sought balance rather than absolute control, that prized restitution over vengeance, that allowed its rules to evolve rather than calcify. In the shadows of their harsher neighbors, the Hittites appear almost merciful, though theirs was still a world of slavery, hierarchy, and inequality. The moderation of their laws was not the mercy of modern justice, but the pragmatism of survival. And yet, that pragmatism speaks across the centuries. It reminds us that justice has always been contested ground, never fixed, always shifting, as societies adapt to their own fractures and frontiers. In the broken tablets of Hattusa, we glimpse not only the Hittite kingdom, but the enduring human struggle to govern through law rather than blood. Was this moderation born of wisdom, or simply of necessity? Did the Hittites glimpse a different path for justice, or were they merely improvising on the edge of empire? The answers remain elusive, locked within tablets scarred by fire and time, but their voice still lingers. A reminder that even in the Bronze Age, law was not only command, but conversation, echoing between the people and their rulers, shaping the fragile peace of daily life. Chapter 19. The Sea Peoples and the Empire's Decline. In the twilight of the 13th century BCE, the great powers of the Eastern Mediterranean began to fracture. From Anatolia to Canaan, from Cyprus to the delta of Egypt, the old order was shaken by forces both visible and unseen. Armies once thought invincible faltered, cities burned, and trade networks that had bound distant lands into fragile unity began to unravel. Among the shadows of this upheaval, one name emerges again and again in Egyptian inscriptions and fragmentary tablets: the Sea Peoples, raiders from the waves, strangers with foreign tongues and unknown gods, descending upon coasts in sudden fury. They appear as if conjured from the sea itself, a collective term for peoples whose true origins remain debated. Were they displaced migrants from the Aegean, mercenaries turned against their masters, or survivors of famine and earthquake seeking new shores? The silence of the Hittite records, broken only by hints and laments, leaves us with more questions than answers. For the Hittite Empire, landlocked in its Anatolian heartland yet tethered to the sea by its coastal vassals, these incursions struck at the foundations of survival. Though Hattusa sat far from the waves, its lifeblood flowed through maritime trade. Grain from Egypt, Cyprus, and Canaan sustained its population. Timber, copper, and luxury goods moved along these routes, ensuring both prosperity and political stability. When the ships no longer came, famine followed. The Hittites themselves speak to us in fragments, tablets that preserve the voice of desperation. A letter from the king of Ugarit, a Syrian port loyal to Hattusa, pleads for help as ships of the enemy descend upon his harbors. In another, a Hittite ruler demands grain from his subjects, for the storehouses of the capital stand empty. The Sea Peoples are never fully named in these documents, but their shadow is unmistakable. Disruption spread not only through violence, but through the collapse of the fragile system of exchange that underpinned empire. The Egyptians provide the most vivid testimony. On the walls of Medinet Habu, Rameses III recorded in triumph his battles against the Sea Peoples in the early 12th century BCE. He depicts them with feathered headdresses, ox-drawn carts carrying families, and ships crowded with warriors. They are not only raiders, but migrants, whole communities on the move, pressing against the frontiers of established powers. Egypt survived their onslaught, though at great cost. The Hittite Empire, by then weakened from within, did not. But was it truly the Sea Peoples who brought the empire to ruin? Or were they but a spark in a landscape already dry with kindling? Archaeology and scholarship suggest deeper causes. Decades of expansion had stretched Hittite resources thin. Suppiluliuma's great conquests had overextended their reach. The constant struggle with Egypt, Assyria, and rebellious vassals drained the treasury. Internal disputes of succession, recorded in the annals of kings like Hattusili III, exposed fractures in the royal house. Climate, too, may have played its role. Recent studies of pollen, tree rings, and sediment cores indicate a period of severe drought in the eastern Mediterranean. during the late 13th century BCE. Crops failed, herds diminished. In a land already strained, famine drove unrest. When grain ships failed to arrive, not because of storm or negligence, but because the sea lanes themselves were no longer safe, desperation deepened. The collapse was not sudden, but cascading. As vassal states along the coast fell, the empire's access to the sea was cut. Ugarit, once a thriving port, was destroyed and never rebuilt. Carchemish, another vital city, came under immense pressure. Without these maritime lifelines, Hattusa itself became a fortress starving in its mountains. Clay tablets reveal urgent appeals for food, but there is no evidence the aid ever came. And then, silence. By around 1200 BCE, the archives of Hattusa cease. The capital, once a city of monumental gates and bustling courts, was abandoned and burned. The cause remains unknown, whether invaders set it aflame, or its own people turned against it in rebellion, or whether the ruling elite simply walked away, unable to sustain its weight. What is certain is that the empire that had stood for centuries, rival to Egypt and Assyria, dissolved into nothingness. In the centuries that followed, smaller Neo-Hittite states emerged, particularly in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia. These principalities preserve fragments of Hittite culture, their hieroglyphs, their gods, their traditions of kingship, yet they were but echoes of a vanished power, surviving on the margins while new empires, the Assyrians, the Arameans, and later the Persians, rose to dominate the land once ruled from Hattusa. The Sea Peoples remain a riddle. Their movements coincide with the collapse of multiple civilizations. Mycenaean palaces fell, Cyprus was ravaged, cities across Canaan burned. Was this the work of a single migrating confederation? Or were the Sea Peoples a symptom? Displaced fragments of societies already collapsing under famine and drought, searching for survival by any means. Their appearance may be less the cause than the reflection of a greater Bronze Age crisis, in which interlinked economies and fragile alliances unraveled together. For the Hittites, their decline was not recorded in monuments of victory, but in the absence of voice. No final proclamation survives, no farewell of a last king etched into stone. Only the traces remain, burned archives, abandoned walls, and scattered tablets half buried in earth. The silence of Hattusa is its final testimony, and so we are left with haunting questions. Did the Sea Peoples truly deliver the final blow? Or were they merely the waves that washed over a structure already crumbling? Was the collapse inevitable, born of climate and overreach? Or was it the tragic accident of converging disasters? The ruins offer no answer. They speak only of fragility, of how even the greatest of empires, woven across mountains and seas, can dissolve into ash within a single generation. The Hittites vanish from history's stage here, but their shadow lingers. In the myths of the storm god, in the echoes of law and diplomacy, in the scattered Neo-Hittite states that carried fragments of their memory forward. Yet the empire itself is gone, consumed in fire, silenced by famine, and lost beneath the tide of the Bronze Age collapse. As the Sea Peoples disappear into mystery, so too does Hattusa. The city that once commanded armies and kings became a ruin on the Anatolian plateau, its walls crumbling under centuries of silence. And in that silence, we hear the unanswered question of every empire, whether decline comes from without, or whether it is always born within. Chapter 20. The fall of Hattusa. High upon the windswept plateau of central Anatolia lies the ruin of Hattusa. Once the beating heart of a superpower, it stood crowned with walls that stretched for miles, studded with monumental gates guarded by lions, sphinxes, and warriors in stone. Here kings presided over rituals to hundreds of gods. Here armies marched forth to Syria and beyond. Here treaties were sealed and tablets inscribed. And yet, by the dawn of the 12th century BCE, all of it was gone. When modern archaeologists began to dig at the site in the early 20th century, they uncovered not the living remnants of a city, but the silence of destruction. Beneath layers of soil and grass lay toppled masonry, charred timbers, and broken idols. Ash blanketed the once glorious temples of the storm god and the sun goddess. The great palace that had echoed with royal decrees was reduced to blackened rubble. The people had fled. The scribes had laid down their styluses. The capital of the Hittite Empire had become a graveyard of stone. The exact cause of this collapse has never been fully explained. The ruins tell a story of violence, yet not of conquest alone. Burnt layers suggest fire, but fire can come from rebellion as well as invasion. Some scholars have argued that the Sea Peoples, whose raids shook the entire Mediterranean, may have struck even here, far inland. Yet Hattusa, perched among the Anatolian highlands, was not an easy target for seaborne invaders. Others imagine enemy states pressing upon the weakened empire, or vassals breaking free in revolt. Still others point to forces more insidious: famine, drought, and the long erosion of loyalty. For the archives themselves, so rich in earlier centuries, fall silent at this moment. No final inscription, no last prayer or decree survives to mark the city's end. The silence itself has become a kind of testimony. A great people, once equal to Egypt and Assyria, vanished without a farewell. Archaeological traces suggest the fall was not instantaneous. In the decades before the final fire, Hattusa shows signs of strain. Construction slowed, storehouses reveal shortages of grain. Letters recovered from allied cities speak of urgent pleas for food. The empire had relied upon shipments of barley and wheat from Syria and Canaan. But when coastal ports were destroyed and sea lanes disrupted, the flow of grain faltered. Hunger followed. Inscriptions hint at subjects abandoning loyalty, at governors turning against their kings. Famine can hollow an empire from within, until its walls, no matter how strong, no longer matter. Climate research in recent decades adds weight to this view. Studies of pollen and lake sediments across Anatolia and the Levant point to a period of prolonged drought in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE. Harvests would have failed year after year. Rivers shrank, herds perished, and fields turned barren. In such conditions, even mighty Hattusa could not endure. When famine and climate combine with political unrest, collapse becomes inevitable. And yet, mystery endures. If enemies destroyed the city, their records do not boast of it. Assyrian annals, otherwise proud of conquest, are silent. Egyptian texts, so often eager to exalt their victories, say nothing of Hattusa's demise. The Sea Peoples depicted on Egyptian walls never name the Hittites among their prey. The city may have burned by its own hand, abandoned and set aflame to prevent occupation by rivals. Or perhaps rebellion within the court, driven by hunger and despair, turned its palaces into pyres. What followed was erasure. For centuries, the name of Hatti faded from memory. Neighboring peoples remembered fragments, stories of lands once ruled by powerful kings. But the empire itself slipped into oblivion. Its gods were absorbed into other pantheons. Its language, once carved in both cuneiform and hieroglyphs, fell into silence. The monumental gates crumbled, half buried in soil and grass. Shepherds led their flocks among the ruins, unaware that beneath their feet lay the capital of a vanished superpower. It was not until the 19th century, when European explorers began tracing ancient sites across Anatolia, that Hattusa stirred again. Local villagers pointed to strange carvings in the stones, enigmatic figures in procession at nearby Yazılıkaya, the open-air sanctuary where the gods of the Hittites once assembled in eternal ranks. Scholars puzzled over the unfamiliar hieroglyphs and undeciphered tablets. Gradually, through excavation and study, the forgotten empire revealed itself. Tens of thousands of clay tablets were uncovered from the palace archives, bringing back voices that had been silent for 3 millennia. The laws, the treaties, the myths, and the pleas for grain all returned to light. Yet the moment of collapse itself remains shrouded. No single theory suffices. Perhaps the Sea Peoples severed trade, while drought withered fields, while rebellious vassals seized their chance. Perhaps invasion, famine, and climate were not rivals but allies, converging to destroy a kingdom already stretched to its limits. Hattusa's fall may not have one cause, but many, each compounding the other, until the weight became unbearable. To stand among the ruins today is to feel that silence. The Lion Gate still rises, its weathered guardians watching an empty road. The King's Gate opens upon grass instead of armies. The great temple, once thronged with priests, is home only to stones and birdsong. Here was the center of an empire that rivaled Egypt and Babylon. Yet now it is a place of stillness, where absence speaks louder than memory. The fall of Hattusa is not only a historical event, but a meditation on fragility. How can a city so mighty vanish so completely, leaving no clear record of its end? How can human ambition, carved in stone and etched in clay, dissolve into silence? The ruins do not answer. They only remind us that even the greatest powers are mortal, that time swallows all empires, and that what seems eternal can vanish in a single generation. And so, Hattusa lingers as a question more than an answer. Its gates open not onto certainty, but into mystery. Its silence invites reflection, not resolution. The fall of the Hittite capital is both an ending and a reminder that history is not a line, but a series of broken echoes, where what is lost may one day be rediscovered, but never fully explained. Chapter 21. The Neo-Hittite Kingdoms of Syria. The empire of the Hittites was gone. Hattusa lay in silence, its gates broken, its archives scattered into ash. But the story did not end there. Across the mountains and valleys of northern Syria and southern Anatolia, the traditions of Hatti endured, not in a single mighty kingdom, but in a constellation of smaller states. These were the so-called Neo-Hittite kingdoms. Heirs of empire, fragments of a shattered whole, clinging to memory while shaping something new. Cities such as Carchemish, Melid, Kumu, and Aleppo rose as guardians of this inheritance. Their rulers claimed descent from the royal lines of the old empire, invoking the names of kings and gods who had once ruled from Hattusa. Their scribes wrote in Illuyan hieroglyphs, the script carved into stone monuments that still stand today. Their temples honored the storm god, the sun goddess of Arinna, and the vast pantheon of Hittite deities. In their courts, rituals echoed the grandeur of the vanished capital, and in their plazas, colossal lions and human figures in relief proclaimed continuity with a world now lost. Yet these were not mere copies of the old order. The Neo-Hittite states lived in a different landscape, one fractured, contested, and crowded with new powers. Aramean tribes pressed in from the desert. Phrygians and other Anatolian peoples carved their own territories from the highlands. Most threatening of all, Assyria loomed in the east, its kings hungry for expansion, its armies relentless. In this unstable environment, the Neo-Hittite kingdoms became both custodians and innovators. Their art reveals this dual identity. In basalt slabs that once lined palace walls, gods stride alongside kings, their forms blending Hittite tradition with Aramean motifs. Lions crouch at gateways, their manes stiff with stylization, guardians of cities that sought to project both strength and legitimacy. Processions of warriors, banqueters, and divine beings march across stone in a visual language at once familiar and transformed. Assyrian influence is also visible. Bearded figures in long robes, winged deities with gestures of power. The result is a hybrid style: Anatolian, Aramean, Assyrian, a bridge between cultures in an age of flux. Carchemish, perched on the banks of the Euphrates, stood as the most prominent of these states. Once a Hittite stronghold, it retained importance long after Hattusa's fall. Its rulers styled themselves not as petty lords but as great kings, a claim etched proudly in hieroglyphs. For a time, Carchemish held sway over surrounding lands, preserving the notion of a Hittite empire in miniature. Melid, further north, also flourished, leaving behind elaborate sculptural programs that spoke to wealth and ambition. But this new order was precarious. The Neo-Hittite kingdoms were never united. They were a patchwork, sometimes allied, often rivals, always vulnerable. The Assyrian kings, beginning in the 9th century BCE, turned their gaze westward. Campaign by campaign, they subdued these small states, first demanding tribute, then seizing territory outright. Monuments from Assyria boast of victories at Carchemish, Kumu, and other Neo-Hittite strongholds. One by one, these heirs of Hatti bowed or fell, and yet the cultural legacy persisted. Even as Assyria conquered, it absorbed. Hittite gods were worshipped in Assyrian lands, their imagery adopted into Assyrian art. Illuyan hieroglyphs continued to be carved for centuries, the last flickers of a script once tied to empire. Religious rituals, myths, and artistic conventions seeded themselves across the Near East. In this way, the Neo-Hittite kingdoms served as conduits. They carried the memory of Hattusa into a new age, blending it with the traditions of others and transmitting it forward. To call them shadows of former glory would be too simple. Shadows fade, but the Neo-Hittite states burned with their own light, even if dimmer than the empire's blaze. They remind us that collapse does not erase identity, it reshapes it. Political power can die, but cultural memory is harder to extinguish. In Carchemish and Melid, in the hybrid art of lions and kings, in the persistence of Illuyan inscriptions, the Hittite world outlived its capital by centuries. Today, travelers to the ruins of these cities can still walk among those stones. In Gaziantep and other museums of Turkey and Syria, the great basalt slabs stand tall, their carved figures staring back across 3 millennia. They tell of kings who refused to surrender the past, of artisans who blended traditions into something enduring, of a people who carried forward their gods and their language long after the empire had died. The Neo-Hittite kingdoms were both heirs and innovators, both guardians and transformers. Their fate under Assyrian conquest reminds us of the fragility of small powers in a world of empires, yet their persistence shows how identity can transcend politics. In them, the Hittites lived on, not as ghosts, but as voices reshaped by time. Chapter 22. The Karatepe inscriptions high in the hills of Cilicia, where the passes of the Taurus Mountains open toward the Mediterranean plain, lies a fortress whose stones hold one of the great keys to the ancient past. The place is called Karatepe, the Black Hill. Today, its ruins are quiet, shaded by pines and overlooking the rugged landscape of southern Turkey. But in the mid-20th century, archaeologists working here uncovered a discovery that would transform our understanding of the Hittite world. Carved into the basalt gateways and walls of Karatepe were long inscriptions, preserved across the centuries with uncanny clarity. What made them extraordinary was not merely their length or their antiquity, but their form. The text was written twice. Once in Phoenician, the alphabet of the great seafarers of the Levant, and once in hieroglyphic Luwian, the pictorial script used by the late Hittite kingdoms. It was, in effect, a bilingual inscription, a Rosetta Stone for the Hittite legacy. Before Karatepe, the Luwian hieroglyphs were a puzzle that resisted decipherment. Scholars had uncovered them on monuments scattered across Anatolia and northern Syria. Lions, kings, gods, and marching warriors, accompanied by enigmatic symbols. These signs were clearly a script, yet their meaning remained elusive. Some scholars thought they were purely decorative, a priestly code, or even an untranslatable system of symbols. Others suspected they held the last living words of the Hittite tradition. Without a bilingual text, the mystery seemed impenetrable. The discovery at Karatepe changed everything. The Phoenician version of the inscription could be read, for it belonged to a family of scripts ancestral to Greek and Latin. Line by line, scholars compared the Phoenician with the hieroglyphic Luwian. Slowly, meaning emerged. A name in Phoenician matched a symbol in Luwian. A phrase describing a king's deeds corresponded with its pictorial equivalent. Piece by piece, the hieroglyphs began to speak. The inscription itself told the story of a ruler named Azatiwada, who styled himself as a servant of the storm god and a guardian of his land. He ruled in the 8th century BCE, long after the empire of Hatti had fallen, yet his words reveal a world still deeply shaped by Hittite traditions. He boasted of building fortifications, bringing prosperity and securing peace. The text blends political authority with divine sanction, echoing the rhetoric of Bronze Age kingship, while framed in the languages of a new age. But more than a royal boast, the Karatepe inscriptions revealed the blending of cultures at a crossroads of civilizations. Here, in the highlands of Cilicia, Phoenician sailors, Aramean tribes, and descendants of the Hittite world met and mingled. The bilingual nature of the text is itself testimony to this fusion. Azatiwada addressed both his local subjects, heirs to the Luwian Hittite tradition, and the wider world of the Eastern Mediterranean, where Phoenician merchants and scribes carried their alphabet across the seas. Through these stones, the mute monuments of the late Hittite kingdoms found their voice once more. Without Karatepe, the hieroglyphic inscriptions of Carchemish, Melid, and other sites might still be indecipherable, their messages locked away. With it, we can now read their histories, their prayers, their royal decrees. Entire chapters of the ancient Near East reopened, like doors long sealed. The physical setting of Karatepe only deepens its symbolic weight. The fortress stood at a strategic pass between Anatolia and the Levant, a threshold where mountains yield to plains, where land routes meet the sea. Control of this region meant power over trade and communication, and Azatiwada's inscriptions proclaim this dominion. The site's stones, inscribed in 2 tongues, mirror its position as a hinge between cultures. When the inscriptions were first studied in the 1940s and 1950s, scholars realized they had not only recovered the history of a local ruler, but also unlocked a script that illuminated centuries of forgotten history. The painstaking work of comparison, sign by sign, produced the breakthrough. What once seemed a silent art of enigmatic symbols became a living language, capable of revealing treaties, rituals, and myths from the twilight of the Hittite world. In this way, Karatepe is more than an archaeological site. It is a reminder of the fragility of memory. Entire languages can vanish in the span of centuries, leaving only mute traces on stone. Without the chance survival of this bilingual text, the hieroglyphic Luwian script might have remained forever mute, its words reduced to patterns without meaning. It took the survival of stone, the persistence of scholars, and the coincidence of a bilingual inscription to bring the voices of forgotten kings back into the light. Today, the inscriptions of Karatepe stand in museums and at the site itself, their symbols etched as if freshly cut, despite the passage of nearly 3,000 years. To walk among them is to sense the delicate thread of continuity that binds us to the ancient world. A thread that can so easily be broken. In their silent endurance, they remind us how much of history has already been lost and how easily more could slip away. The Karatepe inscriptions brought language back to life. They allowed the late Hittite kingdoms to speak in their own words, not just through the eyes of their enemies or successors. They revealed a world of cultural blending, where Phoenician letters and Hittite hieroglyphs stood side by side, and where identities were layered rather than singular. And yet, even as these stones illuminate, they also remind us of the abyss that surrounds them. How many scripts remain undeciphered? How many voices lie forever silenced beneath the soil? Karatepe was a narrow bridge across forgetfulness, but most bridges never survive. As the sun sets over the black hill, shadows stretch across the carved lions and walls. The inscriptions catch the light, their symbols momentarily glowing as if alive. In those fleeting moments, the words of Azatiwada and his world whisper once more. Fragile echoes from a civilization that refused to be forgotten, and yet, like all others, remains on the edge of silence. Chapter 23. Echoes in the Hebrew Bible. In the sacred texts of Israel, names drift across the page like shadows of forgotten nations. Among them, one name appears again and again: the Hittites. They are listed among the peoples of Canaan, mentioned as allies, adversaries, and neighbors. In the stories of Abraham and David, they stand as familiar presences, woven into the fabric of biblical memory. Yet here lies a mystery. By the time the Hebrew Bible took its written form, the great Hittite empire of Anatolia had already vanished into silence. Its capital lay in ruins, its archives buried in the soil, its very existence erased from the histories of its neighbors. And yet the word remained. The first mention comes early, in the book of Genesis. Abraham, seeking a burial place for his wife Sarah, negotiates with the sons of Heth, described as Hittites. They offer him the cave of Machpelah at Hebron, an act of generosity framed in solemn detail. To the biblical authors, the Hittites were not distant strangers, but a people of the land, dwelling among the patriarchs in the hills of Canaan. Later, in the laws of Moses, the Hittites are listed among the peoples whose ways must not be followed, neighbors whose customs might lead Israel astray. In the narratives of the monarchy, they appear again. Uriah the Hittite, a loyal soldier of King David, whose tragic fate is bound to the story of Bathsheba. Across these scattered references, the name persists, like a faint refrain from a forgotten song. But who were these Hittites of the Bible? For centuries, scholars puzzled over the question. Some assumed they were merely a local tribe in Canaan, one of many small groups whose memory lingered in Israelite tradition. Others suspected a deeper connection, that the biblical Hittites carried an echo of the mighty empire that once ruled Anatolia and Syria. The challenge lay in the silence of history. Until the late 19th century, the Hittite Empire itself was unknown. No Greek historian spoke of it. No Egyptian inscription explained its fall. For the scholars of earlier centuries, the Hittites were only what the Bible said they were: a minor people, remembered in passing. The rediscovery of Hattusa transformed the debate. When archaeologists unearthed the archives of the Hittite kings in the early 20th century, a new horizon opened. Suddenly, it became clear that an empire had once stretched across Anatolia and northern Syria, rivaling Egypt and Assyria in power. Here were treaties, annals, and royal decrees, an entire civilization hidden in clay. And with that discovery, the biblical puzzle sharpened. Could the Hittites of Canaan be linked to the imperial Hittites whose dominion once reached the Levant? The answer is layered and uncertain. The empire of Hatti, centered in central Anatolia, did extend into Syria during its height in the 14th and 13th centuries BCE. Cities like Carchemish, Aleppo, and Ugarit stood within its orbit. Ruled by Hittite viceroys and allied kings, it is entirely possible that migrants, merchants, or soldiers of Hittite descent filtered into Canaan, leaving traces in local memory. Yet the biblical references often appear centuries later, in contexts far removed from the empire's peak. By the time of the Israelite kingdoms, the Hittite heartland was long abandoned. What remained in the southern Levant were smaller Neo-Hittite states and scattered communities who carried the old name into new generations. This, perhaps, explains the duality. The Hittites of the Bible may not be the great kings of Hattusa, but their name endured through the shifting landscapes of identity. In Carchemish and Hamath, in Melid and Kumu, local dynasties preserved Hittite traditions well into the first millennium BCE. They wrote in Illuyan hieroglyphs, built lion-guarded gates, and invoked the storm god in ritual. Their influence may have reached the scribes of Israel, who preserved the name even if they no longer remembered the empire it once signified. There is also the question of memory itself, why some names survive while others vanish. The Hittites disappeared so completely from the annals of Greece and Rome that when their rediscovery came, it stunned the modern world. And yet, through the Hebrew Bible, the name never fully died. It passed quietly through centuries of recitation and translation, whispered in prayers and sermons, long after the ruins of Hattusa lay forgotten beneath Anatolia's hills. In a sense, the biblical text became the vessel of their survival, carrying the word across millennia until archaeology could restore its lost meaning. But the echoes also raise unsettling questions. Why was the empire forgotten when Egypt and Babylon remained vivid in cultural memory? Did the silence reflect deliberate erasure, or simply the accidents of history, where one archive is preserved and another is lost? Was the biblical survival of the word Hittite a fragile thread, the last remnant of a tapestry otherwise burned away? These are mysteries without certain answers, yet they reveal how fragile the chain of memory can be. When modern readers encounter Uriah the Hittite or the sons of Heth, they rarely imagine the vast palaces of Hattusa, the chariot armies of Kadesh, or the silver tablets of the Eternal Peace Treaty. And yet, in the faint echo of a single word, all of that past lingers unseen, like an afterimage beneath the text. The Bible, in this way, became both a guardian of memory and a veil. It preserved the name, but it concealed the empire. Only archaeology could lift that veil, revealing the forgotten greatness behind the ancient word. Today, we read these references with double vision. On one side, the local communities of Canaan remembered by the biblical authors. On the other, the shadow of a vanished superpower whose reach extended into the very lands where those stories were set. Between them lies the gap of memory, a chasm where centuries of history were lost. To stand at that gap is to feel both the endurance and the fragility of human remembrance. The Hittites of the Bible may not have been the kings of Hattusa, but without those scattered echoes, perhaps even the name itself would have been lost. The empire might have been buried not only in soil, but in silence, irretrievable without language to call it forth. Instead, the word lived on, waiting for stone archives and broken tablets to awaken its forgotten story. And so, in the interplay between scripture and archaeology, between text and ruin, the Hittites stand at once present and absent, remembered and erased. The Bible preserved their name, the earth preserved their voice. Together, they whisper fragments of a civilization that once stood among the greatest of its age, and yet, like so many others, slipped into the shadows of time. Chapter 24. The Rediscovery of a Superpower. For centuries, the Hittites existed only as faint traces in the sacred texts of Israel. They appeared as neighbors of Abraham, as soldiers in David's army, as one people among many in the shadowy landscapes of Canaan. To historians of the 18th and 19th centuries, they were little more than a biblical curiosity, perhaps a small tribe, perhaps a people misremembered. The great empires of Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon dominated the pages of history, while the Hittites remained a mystery, a name without a story. But beneath the quiet fields of central Anatolia, the stones of their lost capital waited. Hidden among rolling hills, half buried under centuries of soil, the ruins of Hattusa kept their silence. When travelers passed through the region, they saw little more than broken walls and scattered lions carved in stone. Local villagers told stories of the castle of the giants. few could have imagined that here once stood the capital of a superpower. The rediscovery began not with armies or kings, but with archaeologists and their persistence. In the 1830s, European travelers first noticed strange hieroglyphs carved into stones at sites across Anatolia and northern Syria. These symbols were unlike the cuneiform of Mesopotamia or the hieroglyphs of Egypt. They spoke in a script that no one could yet read, marking monuments that seemed out of place and out of time. Scholars speculated about forgotten peoples, inventing theories that hovered between history and legend. By the late 19th century, curiosity deepened. In 1834, the French archaeologist Charles Texier visited the ruins of Boghazköy, a site in the heart of Anatolia. He described massive city walls and gates guarded by carved lions, yet he could not name the people who had built them. It would take decades before the truth emerged. In the 1880s and 1890s, further surveys revealed inscriptions in both cuneiform and the mysterious Anatolian hieroglyphs. Slowly, a picture began to form. The decisive breakthrough came with the spade. German expeditions, led by Hugo Winkler in the early 20th century, began systematic excavations at Boghazköy. In 1906, their work uncovered a treasure beyond imagination. Tens of thousands of clay tablets, buried in palace archives, written in cuneiform. Here, for the first time, the voices of the Hittites themselves emerged. The tablets spoke in an unknown language, neither Babylonian nor Assyrian. At first, it seemed an enigma, a lost tongue beyond reach. Then came the decipherment. In 1915, the Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný announced a stunning revelation. The Hittite language was Indo-European. Against expectations, the speech of these forgotten kings belonged to the same broad family as Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. The words of the tablets, their treaties, laws, and myths, could now be read. The effect was electrifying. An empire erased from memory was suddenly restored to history, its contours traced not in legend, but in its own voice. Piece by piece, scholars reconstructed the outlines of the Hittite state. The annals of kings like Hattusili, Musili II, and Suppiluliuma revealed campaigns across Anatolia and Syria. The eternal peace treaty with Egypt, once a line in Egyptian inscriptions, was found inscribed in Hittite archives as well. For the first time, the balance of power in the late Bronze Age could be seen in full. Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittites, 5 great powers in fragile balance. The Hittites were no longer a footnote. They were central actors in the drama of their age. Yet the rediscovery brought not only triumph but humility. Even as archives were uncovered and languages deciphered, much remained hidden. The kings spoke in annals and decrees, but the daily lives of farmers, traders, and artisans were barely visible. We know of laws that regulated theft, marriage, and livestock, but rarely do we hear the voice of the ordinary people themselves. The clay preserved the machinery of state, but the whispers of village hearths dissolved into silence. The rediscovery also reshaped how the ancient Near East was understood. For generations, scholars had relied on the accounts of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Now, another voice joined the chorus, offering a new perspective. Hittite myths revealed echoes of Indo-European traditions, linking Anatolia to a wider world of language and story. Treaties showed diplomacy conducted on equal terms with pharaohs and kings. The Hittites were not peripheral, they were a superpower, standing at the crossroads of continents. Still, mysteries endure. Why did the empire collapse so suddenly around 1200 BCE? Why did its memory vanish so completely that even the Greeks, who inherited fragments of Near Eastern lore, left no mention of Hatti? And why did the name survive only in the Hebrew Bible, stripped of its imperial grandeur? Archaeology has offered answers in fragments, but never the whole. Famine, invasion, rebellion, each plays a part, yet the silence remains heavier than the evidence. Today, visitors walk through the reconstructed gates of Hattusa, past the Lion Gate and the King's Gate, across the great temple precincts where the storm god was once invoked. The landscape is quiet, broken only by wind and the calls of birds. It is difficult to imagine the thunder of chariots, the murmur of scribes pressing wedges into clay, the chanting of priests before stone gods. Yet beneath the earth, the archives still whisper, waiting for new excavations to uncover more of their forgotten words. The rediscovery of the Hittites is both a triumph and a warning. It shows the power of archaeology to restore what was lost, to lift entire civilizations out of silence. But it also reminds us how fragile history is, how easily memory can vanish. For 3,000 years, the Hittites were absent from the world's story. Their empire was gone, their name reduced to a biblical echo, only by chance. Through buried tablets and persistent scholars, were they restored? How many other empires lie still beneath the soil, their names erased, their languages mute? How many stories have been lost beyond recall, their echoes too faint to recover? The Hittites remind us that history is not fixed, but fragile, dependent on what survives, on what is found, on what is remembered. As we close the story of their rediscovery, we stand at the threshold between presence and absence. The kings of Hatti, once rulers of a vast domain, now speak again through broken clay and carved stone. Their voices return, but only in fragments. The rest is silence. The silence of a superpower that rose, ruled, and was forgotten, until the earth itself revealed its buried memory. Chapter 25. Reflections. Among the ruins, in the heart of Anatolia, far from the Mediterranean's shining coasts and the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, the ruins of Hattusa still wait. Travelers who come here walk along stone ramparts that once guarded a superpower. They enter through gates once adorned with lions and sphinxes, and step into silence broken only by wind. The city is vast yet empty, its streets little more than outlines on the earth. Where once thousands of voices rose in prayers and commands, today only echoes remain. The walls are not whole. They rise in broken fragments, stitched together by reconstruction and memory. The stones themselves are mute, yet they seem to whisper when touched. They tell of masons who hauled them into place, of soldiers who patrolled their length, of kings who looked out from towers across a domain stretching to the Levant. But the words of these walls are faint, requiring imagination to hear. To the north of the city lies Yazılıkaya, the rock sanctuary where the gods of Hatti were carved into living stone. Here, rows of deities march along the cliff face, their names preserved in hieroglyphs. The storm god, the sun goddess, the protectors of fields, mountains, and battle. In the shadows of these reliefs, rituals once unfolded with chant and incense, binding the world of humans to the order of the divine. Today, the carvings are weathered, yet they still stand, guardians of a vanished cosmos. At the Lion Gate, travelers pause. The lion's eyes, worn smooth by time, once glared at enemies and traders alike as they entered the capital. The threshold beneath them is hollowed by centuries of footsteps. Soldiers, merchants, emissaries, pilgrims. Passing through, one feels the press of time, as though stepping into the shadow of countless lives, whose stories are now untold. The Hittites left behind treaties written in clay, myths pressed into tablets, and laws that ordered their society. We know their kings by name, their campaigns by route, their gods by title. Yet the deeper currents of their lives remain hidden. What songs did shepherds sing in the highlands? What stories did mothers tell their children by firelight? What fears, what hopes, what laughter carried through their homes? The ruins cannot answer. They remind us that history's record is always incomplete, always fragmentary. Standing among the stones, the question lingers: how can a superpower be forgotten? Egypt remembered its pharaohs. Mesopotamia remembered its kings. Yet Hatti dissolved almost entirely into silence. For 3,000 years, no one spoke of it. The name survived only in the Bible, detached from its true empire, diminished to a memory of scattered peoples. How could such grandeur vanish so utterly? Perhaps this is the most haunting lesson of Hattusa: the impermanence of power, the fragility of memory, the certainty that even the mightiest empires can fall not only into ruin, but into oblivion. For centuries, the Hittites ruled as equals to pharaohs. They commanded armies, forged alliances, and wrote laws that endured for generations. Yet time erased their place in the story. It took archaeology to bring them back. The stones invite reflection not only on the past, but on ourselves. What will remain of us 3,000 years from now? Which of our monuments will endure and which will crumble? Which stories will be told and which forgotten? Will the outlines of our cities be traced by strangers, puzzled at our absence, inventing stories of what we were? As evening falls over Hattusa, shadows lengthen across the ruins. The silence grows heavier, and the stones seem to recede once more into memory. The gods of Yazılıkaya fade into the dusk, their procession eternal but unseen. The Lion Gate watches, its guardians no longer fierce but solemn, witnesses to the passage of centuries. The Hittites are gone, yet not gone. Their words, their treaties, their myths live again through clay and stone. Their city lies in ruin, yet their story endures in the hands of those who uncover, translate, and remember. They remind us that civilizations rise and fall, that memory itself is fragile, and that history is not a single voice but a chorus, one in which many voices have been lost. Among the ruins, we feel the weight of silence, but also the persistence of echoes. The Hittites are not fully restored nor fully forgotten. They exist in the space between, reminders of the impermanence of power and of the enduring search to remember. And so, standing among the broken walls of Hattusa, we are left with a question that no tablet can answer, and no stone can proclaim, what does it mean to endure?